Elizabeth Carter burned her brother's last letter on a Tuesday morning, and she didn't cry once. She watched the paper curl and blacken in the dirt, and for the first time in 6 years, she felt something close to free. But freedom, she was learning, had a price, and she had exactly $3.40 to pay it. If this story already has your heart beating faster, subscribe to this channel, follow every part until the very end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The letter had arrived on a Monday. It was short. Samuel Carter never wasted words on his sister, only commands. And this particular command was the cruelest one he had ever written, which was saying something because Samuel Carter had been writing cruel things to Elizabeth since the day their mother closed her eyes for the last time and left the two of them alone in a farmhouse that smelled of medicine and old grief. "Come home," the letter said. "Arrangements have been made. You will marry Gerald Finch before the month is out." This is not a request. Elizabeth had read those words 3 times standing in the narrow hallway of the boarding house where she'd been renting a room for the past 8 months. She read them once with confusion, once with disbelief, and once with something that started as fear and finished as fury. Then she walked outside, crouched in the dirt behind the boarding house fence, struck a match, and held it to the corner of the paper. She watched Samuel's handwriting turn to smoke. And she did not cry once. What she did was sit down in the dirt, right there, not caring that her skirt was getting dusty, not caring that Mrs. Holbrook from the boarding house might see her through the window, and she opened the small tin box she kept inside her dress pocket. She counted what was inside. $3.40. A folded advertisement torn from a newspaper she'd found on a bench at the train depot 2 weeks earlier. She unfolded it now. Honest man seeking hard-working partner for mountain ranch operation. Wages fair. Work is real. No luxury promised. Respect guaranteed. Write to Nathan Cole, Harlan Ridge, Colorado Territory. She had read that advertisement so many times the paper was soft at the folds. She had almost written 3 times and talked herself out of it each time, telling herself it was foolish. Telling herself she didn't know this man. Telling herself that running toward a stranger was no better than running away from a brother. But Samuel's letter changed the mathematics of her choices. Because Elizabeth Carter was 26 years old, and she had been running away from things her whole life, from her brother's temper, from the whispers of Willow Creek, from the memory of her mother's face the last morning she was alive. And she had gotten very, very tired of running away. Maybe it was time, she thought, to run toward something instead. She picked up her skirt, walked back inside the boarding house, sat down at the small writing desk in her room, and wrote the most important letter of her life in under 4 minutes. "Mr. Cole," she wrote, "I am a woman who can cook, keep books, mend fences if you show me how, and work from sunup to dark without complaint. I am not looking for promises. I am looking for a place where I am treated like a person. If that is something your ranch can offer, I will be on the next train toward Harlan Ridge. Elizabeth Carter." She mailed it that same afternoon. His reply came 6 days later. It said, "Come." Just that. 1 word. She packed her leather bag that night. Chakang. Willow Creek had never been kind to Elizabeth Carter. Even as a child, she had understood that kindness in that town was a currency distributed unequally, poured generously over the families with land and money, and poured in thin, grudging drops over families like hers, who had neither. Her father had been a decent man, quiet and hard-working, but debt followed him the way shadows follow late afternoon. He died when Elizabeth was 14, leaving behind a mortgaged farm, 2 children, and a wife whose grief was too big for her body to hold for long. Her mother lasted 2 more years. Then it was just Elizabeth and Samuel was 22 years old and furious at the world for everything it had not given him. He took that fury out on what was in front of him, which was Elizabeth. It started small, the way those things always do. Criticism at dinner, instructions she hadn't asked for, corrections to everything she did, the way she swept the floor, the way she folded the laundry, the way she spoke to neighbors at church on Sundays. "You're too loud," he'd tell her. "You're too familiar. You make us look common." She learned to be quieter, to fold herself smaller. But Samuel's standards kept shifting. The target kept moving. And no matter how careful she was, how small she made herself, how thoroughly she erased her own preferences and opinions from every room she walked into, it was never enough. The night that broke her happened 2 years ago, on a Wednesday in October, in front of what felt like half of Willow Creek. She had been at the general store picking up flour and salt, and she had made the mistake of correcting Samuel's account with Mr. Briggs, the storekeeper. Samuel had been overcharged. She could see it in the ledger. Clearly a simple error of addition, and she pointed it out quietly, politely. Just a gentle correction. Samuel had gone very still. Then he turned to her in front of Mr. Briggs and his wife and the 3 other customers standing in that store, and he said loudly and without a trace of shame, "Nobody asked for your opinion, Elizabeth. You're here to carry flour, not to think." The store went quiet. Mrs. Briggs looked at the floor. The other customers looked at the walls, the ceiling, anywhere but at Elizabeth's face. And Elizabeth stood there with her hands around the flour sack, and she felt something shift inside her chest, something that had been slowly tilting for years, finally tipping all the way over. She put the flour on the counter. She looked at her brother, and she said very quietly, "You were overcharged by 40 cents, Samuel. It's in the ledger." She put the correct amount on the counter, picked up her purchases, and walked out the door. He didn't speak to her for 4 days after that, and when he finally did, it was only to tell her that she was ungrateful, that she was difficult, that no man in Willow Creek would ever want a woman who couldn't keep her mouth closed, and that she ought to be grateful she had a roof over her head at all. She started thinking about leaving that same week. It took her 6 more months to actually do it, to save enough from the small amounts she earned mending clothes for neighbors to find a place to go to get herself to the train depot without Samuel knowing. She had left in the early morning before the sun was fully up with her leather bag and her tin box and the clothes on her back. She had walked to the depot with her head down and her pace steady, and she had not looked back once, because she knew if she looked back, she would see the farmhouse and the elm tree in the yard where her mother used to hang laundry, and she would lose her nerve entirely. She had not lost her nerve. She had bought a ticket to the nearest large town, rented a room at the boarding house, found work where she could mending, cooking, helping a local seamstress, and she had been surviving. Barely. But surviving. Until Gerald Finch. Until Samuel's letter. Until the match and the burned paper and Nathan Cole's single-word reply. Come. The train to Harlan Ridge took most of a day and deposited her at a small depot that was really just a wooden platform in a tin-roofed shed with a handwritten sign. She stepped off with her leather bag and her tin box and $3.40. She'd spent nothing on the journey, eating only the biscuits she'd packed herself, and she stood on the platform in the afternoon heat and looked around at the mountains rising in every direction, green and steep and enormous, and she thought, well, here I am. She had arranged to meet Nathan Cole at the depot. He was late. She stood for 20 minutes in the sun, which was fierce and direct at this altitude in July. And she told herself she was not nervous, which was a lie. And she told herself she had not made a terrible mistake, which she was less certain about with every passing minute. Then she heard boots on the wooden planking behind her. She turned. Nathan Cole was taller than she'd imagined from his advertisement, broader through the shoulders. He wore a brown leather vest over a faded work shirt, dark trousers, worn boots that had seen considerable miles. He had dark brown hair, a rough beard that hadn't been trimmed recently, and a face that the Colorado sun had weathered into something that looked carved rather than grown. He stopped a few feet away from her and looked at her with dark eyes that were steady and unreadable. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then he said, "Miss Carter." Not a question. A statement, as if he had known exactly who she was the moment he saw her. "Mr. Cole," she said. He glanced at her bag, at her face, at the space around her, the way a man accustomed to reading landscapes reads them for information, not for judgment. "You eat today," he said. She blinked. Of all the things she had imagined this man saying to her, questions about her experience, her background, her reasons for answering an advertisement from a stranger, she had not imagined that. "Some biscuits on the train," she said. He nodded once. "There's a place in town. We'll get you a proper meal before we ride up." "I'm fine," she said automatically, because 6 years of Samuel had trained her to take up as little space as possible, to need as little as possible, to cost as little as possible. Nathan looked at her steadily. "I didn't ask if you were fine," he said. "I said we'd get a proper meal." He said it without sharpness, without command. Just as a fact, simple and settled, the way you'd state that the sun rises in the east. Elizabeth stared at him for a moment. Then, surprising herself, she said, "All right." The town of Harlan Ridge was small, a main street, a handful of businesses, a church at the far end, and the eating house Nathan took her to was run by a wide woman named Clara, who brought out plates of beans and cornbread and salt pork without being asked, and poured coffee from a pot that looked like it had been in continuous use since approximately 1850. Nathan ate steadily and quietly, and Elizabeth found that his silence was not the cold, punishing kind she was accustomed to. It was just silence, easy, uncomplicated. She ate more than she'd intended. The food was plain, but there was plenty of it, and she had been careful with money long enough that plain and plentiful felt like luxury. When Clara came back to refill the coffee, she looked at Elizabeth with open curiosity. "You Nathan's new hire," she said. "Yes," Elizabeth said at the same moment Nathan said, "She's come to help run the ranch." Clara looked between them with something complicated in her expression. "Where you from, honey?" she said. "Willow Creek," Elizabeth said. "Long way," Clara said. "Yes," Elizabeth agreed. Clara looked at Nathan. Some kind of understanding passed between them, the kind that exists between people who have known each other a long time, and then Clara went back to her counter. Nathan pushed his empty plate aside. "Ranch is about 2 hours up from here," he said. "The trail's steep in places. You comfortable on horseback?" "I can manage," Elizabeth said, which was true. She had ridden on the farm, though nothing like mountain terrain. "I've got a mare that's easy," he said. "She'll take care of you." "I don't need taking care of," she said, and then caught herself because it had come out sharper than she intended. All those years of Samuel telling her she was helpless, she supposed, had made her reflexively defensive against any suggestion of the same. Nathan looked at her without offense. "I know that," he said. "I meant the terrain. It's new to you. She knows it well, that's all." He met her eyes briefly, then looked back down at his coffee cup, giving her the space to feel embarrassed about her own defensiveness without making a thing of it. She felt her shoulders come down half an inch. "Thank you," she said quietly. He nodded once, like it was nothing. The ride up the mountain was exactly what he'd said it would be. Steep in places, the trail narrowing between trees and rock, the air getting cooler as they climbed the valley, falling away below them, until Harlan Ridge was just a cluster of rooftops far beneath. Elizabeth rode behind Nathan on the easy mare he'd promised, who was in fact exactly as described, sure-footed and calm, picking her way up the trail without any anxiety, which was more than Elizabeth could say for herself. But she had not come this far to fall apart on a mountainside. She focused on the horse's ears, on the sound of hooves on stone, on the smell of pine in the summer air, which was nothing like the flat farmland smell of Willow Creek, which was nothing like anything she'd known before, and maybe that was fine. Maybe that was good. Nathan rode ahead without speaking much, occasionally glancing back to check she was managing, but never hovering, never fussing. When she hit a rough section of trail and the mare lurched slightly sideways, he reined in and waited for her to regain her seat. And when she did, he said simply, "That's the tricky part. Smooth after here," and kept riding. No alarm, no condescension, just information. She is a person, she thought, suddenly echoing words. She had imagined herself saying words she had wanted someone to say on her behalf for a very long time. She is a person, and she chooses where she belongs. She didn't know where that thought had come from. This man hadn't said anything like it. But riding up the mountain behind him in the long summer afternoon, with the clean air in her lungs and the valley spreading out below her, and the mare steady beneath her, she felt the knot in her chest, the one she'd been carrying so long, She'd stopped noticing it loosen just slightly around the edges. The ranch came into view around a bend in the trail as the sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks. A low, solid log cabin, a good-sized barn, a split-rail fence enclosing a pasture, a kitchen garden that had gone a bit wild without consistent attention. It was not elegant. It was not even comfortable looking, not yet. But it was solid. Built by hands that knew what they were doing, built to last. Elizabeth looked at it for a long moment. "It's real," she said, more to herself than to him. Nathan had reined in beside her without her quite noticing. "What did you think it would be?" he said. "I wasn't sure," she admitted. "When you answer an advertisement in a newspaper and get on a train to go somewhere you've never been, you tell yourself stories about what you'll find. And then you try not to believe the stories too much because most of the time, the real thing is different." He was quiet for a moment, studying the cabin the way she was. "Different good or different bad?" he said. She looked at him. The evening light caught the side of his face, the angles of it, the steadiness in his eyes. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "But different real. That counts for something." Something shifted in his expression, not a smile exactly, but a softening around the eyes like a door opened a fraction of an inch. "Yeah," he said. "It does." They rode down to the ranch in the last of the summer light. He showed her around the cabin without ceremony. Main room, kitchen corner. The small bedroom in the back that would be hers, he'd set up a cot, a trunk, a wooden hook on the wall. "Not much," he said, which was accurate. "It's fine," she said, which was also accurate. After 8 months in a single rented room in a boarding house, after 2 years of walking carefully around Samuel Carter's moods, in a house that had never felt like home, a cot and a trunk and a hook on the wall felt like enough. "You'll be comfortable," he said. "Yes," she said. He nodded. He was about to leave the doorway when she said quickly before she could stop herself, "Why did you choose me?" He stopped, turned. "What?" he said. "You put an advertisement in the paper," she said. "You got replies. I know I'm not the most obvious choice. I have no experience with mountain ranching. I've never been to Colorado before today. I don't know this terrain or this climate or this—" She stopped, made herself slow down. "I want to understand why you wrote back. Why you said come." Nathan Cole looked at her for a long moment with those steady, unreadable dark eyes. "You wrote that you were looking for a place where you were treated like a person," he said. She waited. "Most of the replies I got asked about wages first," he said. "Asked about the house. Asked what kind of man I was." He paused. "Yours didn't ask anything. It just said what you were and what you needed." He looked at the floor briefly, then back up. "I figured a person who asks for respect instead of comfort is a person who'll do the real work," he said. "That's what I need." It was a practical answer, a ranch owner's answer, but there was something underneath it that she tucked away to think about later. "Thank you," she said, "for answering." He nodded once. "Thank you for coming." He left her alone with the cot and the trunk and the hook on the wall, and Elizabeth Carter, 26 years old, who had burned her brother's letter and gotten on a train and ridden up a mountain in the Colorado summer to meet a stranger. Elizabeth Carter sat down on the edge of that cot and put her face in her hands. She did not cry. She had spent 6 years not crying in front of Samuel Carter, and the habit was bone deep by now. But she sat in the silence of the mountain ranch, and she breathed slow and deliberate, and she felt the knot in her chest shift again, loosen another fraction, and she thought real. This is real, and real is something to work with. She was up before Nathan the next morning. She found the kitchen corner and its limited supplies, and she made coffee and cornmeal mush and figured out the temperamental stove through a combination of observation and stubbornness. And when Nathan came through from his side of the cabin pulling on his vest in the early mountain light, he stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the coffee and the pot on the stove, and then at her. "You didn't have to," he said. "I wanted to," she said. I'm here to work. This is work. He poured himself a cup of coffee, tasted it, looked at her again. You made it right, he said. She wasn't sure why that particular sentence, 4 small words barely worth counting, made something warm and unexpected move through her chest. But it did. My mother taught me, she said. She sounds like she was a good teacher, he said. She was a good woman, Elizabeth said, and was surprised by how easily the words came out, how much she meant them, how they didn't hurt quite the way she expected. Nathan drank his coffee and didn't press further, and she was grateful for that. They ate at the small table in the main room, mostly in silence, but a comfortable silence, and then he laid out the work for the day. What needed doing around the ranch, what her tasks would be, what he expected in terms of hours and effort, and he spoke to her the whole time, like someone who had already decided she was capable of understanding him, which was different, she realized, from every man who had spoken to her in recent memory. She listened carefully, and said she understood, and went to work. The days settled into a rhythm. Hard work, real physical demanding work, the kind that left her muscles aching in ways she hadn't known since childhood on her father's farm. But it was work that meant something. Work that produced visible results. A cleaner kitchen, a better organized storage room, a garden that responded to attention, a system of accounts that finally made sense when she sat down with Nathan's ledger and quietly reorganized 3 years' worth of records into something coherent. That was the day he found her at the table with his ledger spread open and 3 pages of her own notes beside it. He stood in the doorway and looked at what she'd done. I'm sorry, she said immediately, sitting up straight. I should have asked. I saw it, and I saw the problem in the column totals, and What problem? He said. Here. She turned the ledger toward him and pointed. This column. These entries don't reconcile with what came in from the Harlan Ridge trading post last November. There's a difference of $14.20. I think there was a recording error somewhere in October. Nathan sat down across from her and studied where she was pointing. He was quiet for a long moment. I've been off in my supply calculations all winter, he said. Couldn't figure out why. Because the October total was wrong, she said. Everything after it was calculated from the wrong number. He looked at her notes, at the corrected figures, at the ledger, back at her. You did all this afternoon, he said. I'm good with numbers, she said simply. It was not a boast, it was just a fact, the way it was a fact that the sky was blue and the mountain air was thin. Numbers had always made sense to her in a way that the people of Willow Creek, including her brother, had always found unsettling. Nathan Cole did not look unsettled. He looked, and this was a new thing to see on a man's face directed at her, impressed. Miss Carter, he said. Elizabeth, she said. Please. He glanced up. Elizabeth. A beat. You ever think about keeping books professionally? I've thought about it, she said carefully. There hasn't been much opportunity. He nodded slowly. He didn't ask why not, didn't press into the space between those words where Willow Creek and Samuel Carter lived. Just accepted the answer she'd given and moved on. There's a merchant in Harlan Ridge who's been looking for someone to help with his accounts, Nathan said. If you're interested, I could introduce you. It'd be additional income for you, your own. She looked at him. Your own. He had said it so matter-of-factly, like it was the most natural thing in the world for a woman to have money of her own, to have work of her own, to have a life that belonged to her, instead of to the nearest man with authority over her. Yes, she said. I'd be interested. He nodded once like it was settled. He went back to looking at the corrected ledger, and she went back to her notes, and the mountain wind moved through the cabin in the long evening silence, and Elizabeth Carter felt for the second time in recent memory the knot in her chest loosen a little further. She had been at the ranch 3 weeks when she learned about his wife. It was not Nathan who told her. It was Clara, the woman who ran the eating house in Harlan Ridge, where Elizabeth went twice a week now to help with the merchant's accounts. You know about Margaret, Clara said without any particular preamble, while Elizabeth was going over the merchant's supply records at a corner table. Elizabeth looked up. Margaret. Nathan's wife, Clara said. Or was. She died. Almost 6 years ago now. Winter of '76. Fever took her, then the baby, then she went. Elizabeth set her pen down slowly. He lost the baby too, 3 days apart. Clara's voice was matter-of-fact, but not unkind. Nathan wasn't the same after. Sold off most of the cattle he'd built up, let the ranch run down for a while, pulled himself back from most people. She looked at Elizabeth with clear, assessing eyes. He's a good man, but he's been alone a long time. Elizabeth thought about the way Nathan moved through the cabin, careful and quiet, not wasting space. The way he didn't ask unnecessary questions. The steadiness in him that had seemed like simple character, but was maybe also the specific stillness of someone who had learned not to lean on things too hard because things could leave. He hasn't said anything, Elizabeth said. He wouldn't, Clara said. That's Nathan. Elizabeth went back to her accounts. But the numbers swam a little before her eyes. She didn't say anything to him either for almost 2 weeks after that. But she watched him differently. She noticed things she had cataloged as character and now understood as something more. The way he stayed outside longer than necessary in the evenings. The particular quietness that came over him. Sometimes at night, the old photograph on the shelf in the main room that she had not looked at closely enough before. She looked at it one afternoon when he was out in the pasture. A woman, young, dark-haired, bright-eyed, standing in front of what was clearly this very cabin, years younger, better kept. Smiling at the camera with total unself-consciousness. Elizabeth studied that photograph for a long time. Then she carefully replaced it in exactly the position she'd found it. That evening at supper, Nathan said without looking up from his plate, "Her name was Margaret, in case Clara said something and you were wondering." Elizabeth was quiet for a moment. "She was lovely," she said. He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was steady but quieter than usual. "Yeah," he said. "She was." The fire in the stove crackled. "I'm sorry," Elizabeth said, "for what you lost." He looked up at her, then directly, which he didn't always do. His dark eyes meeting hers across the small table. "I'm sorry for what you left behind," he said. She held his gaze. It was the first time she realized that anyone had offered her that. Not a solution, not advice, not a door or a road or a plan. Just the acknowledgement of the leaving itself and the understanding that leaving could be its own kind of loss, even when it was also the only right thing. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once. They finished supper in silence, but it was the kind of silence that held things instead of hiding them. The letter from Samuel Carter arrived at the Harlan Ridge post office on a Thursday in early August. Elizabeth knew before she opened it. She recognized the handwriting, aggressive, angular, the letters pressed hard into the paper, like he was making a point with the pen itself. She stood on the boardwalk outside the post office and held it for a moment without opening it. A woman coming out of the dry goods store nodded at her. A boy ran past, chasing a dog. Elizabeth looked down at her brother's handwriting. Then she walked to the bench beside the post office wall, sat down in the morning sun, and opened it. "Elizabeth," it began. "Not dear Elizabeth. Never that. I know where you are. A man from Willow Creek saw you at the Harlan Ridge Depot last month. You have disgraced this family by running away like a coward and living on a strange man's property. Gerald Finch is still willing to take you, though God knows why. You will come home. If you don't, I will come and get you myself. Don't make me do that." She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully along its original creases and put it in her dress pocket. She sat in the summer sun for another minute, her hands still in her lap, very steady. She was not going back. She had known it before she opened the letter, and she knew it more certainly after. She was not going back to Willow Creek. She was not going to marry Gerald Finch, and she was not going to let Samuel Carter's handwriting on paper make her hands shake. They were not shaking. She stood up, straightened her skirt, and went to finish her morning at the merchant's accounts. But riding back up to the ranch that afternoon with the mountains above and the valley below and the summer heat pressing down through the pine canopy, She thought about what Samuel had written. "I will come and get you myself." He meant it. She knew him well enough to know he meant it. And she thought, "When he comes, who will be standing beside me?" She thought of Nathan Cole at the train depot, studying her bag and her face with those steady dark eyes. "Whatever you left behind," he had said, "you don't have to fear it here." She had not told him yet what she'd left behind. She thought maybe it was time. She told him that evening after supper, when the light was going gold through the windows, and the ranch was settling into its end-of-day quiet. She sat across from him at the table, and she told him about Samuel. Not all of it, not every individual instance, but enough. The control, the general store, Gerald Finch, the letter. Nathan listened without interrupting. When she finished, the cabin was quiet for a moment. "He's going to come," she said. "I know him. He said it, and he means it." Nathan was quiet for another moment, turning his coffee cup slowly in his hands. "And what do you want to happen when he does?" he said. She looked at him. "I want to stay," she said. "I want to keep my work here, and my accounts in town, and the life I've been building. I'm not going back." "All right," Nathan said. Just that. Simple and settled the way he'd said we'll get a proper meal at the depot. Like it had already been decided, and there was no further discussion necessary. She looked at him carefully. "You understand what I'm saying?" she said. "My brother will not be polite. He'll make accusations. He'll cause trouble." "I've dealt with trouble before," Nathan said, meeting her eyes with that steady, unbothered gaze. "This is my trouble," she said. "Not yours." Something moved across his expression, not quite impatience, but close to it, the faintest edge of a man who had said a thing clearly and was not sure why it needed repeating. "You're here," he said. "That makes it mine too." She stared at him. He looked back at her with those dark, steady eyes and said nothing further, because apparently he felt he had said enough, and looking at him now, Elizabeth thought he probably had. She looked down at the table, then back up. "All right," she said. Outside, the summer wind moved through the pines on the mountain, and far below, Harlan Ridge was just a scattering of lights going on in the early evening, small and distant. Elizabeth Carter, who had burned her brother's first letter and would not answer his second, sat in the cabin of a mountain ranch and felt for the first time in a very long time that she was not facing what was coming alone. The mountain was real. The work was real. Nathan Cole sitting across from her with his rough hands wrapped around his coffee cup and his eyes steady and sure was real. And tomorrow was real. And that she had learned was something to work with. The morning after Elizabeth told Nathan about Samuel, she woke up expecting things to feel different. They didn't, and somehow that was the most reassuring thing of all. Nathan was already up when she came out of her room, already had coffee on, already had his boots laced and his vest on, and a list of the day's work laid out in his head, the way she was coming to understand he always did. He looked up when she came through the doorway, said morning, poured her a cup of coffee, and went back to checking the leather strap on a harness that needed mending. No dramatic speech, no reassurances, no awkward acknowledgement of the conversation that had ended their evening. Just morning, just coffee, just work. Elizabeth wrapped both hands around the cup and felt something settle quietly in her chest. She had spent 6 years waiting for the morning after a difficult conversation with Samuel to reveal how angry he was, how long the punishment would last, how cold the silence would be, whether she would spend the day walking on eggshells or actual broken glass. She had learned to read the angle of her brother's shoulders, the set of his jaw, the particular way he stirred his coffee when he was storing something up against her. Nathan's shoulders were relaxed. His jaw was its normal self. He stirred nothing. "Fence line on the east pasture needs checking," he said, still working on the harness. "2 posts looked soft to me yesterday. I'll get to them after I see to Hector's front shoe." Hector was the larger of his 2 horses, a dark bay with opinions about his own feet. "I'll start on the storage room," Elizabeth said. "I want to move the dry goods to the higher shelves before the weather turns." He looked up. "Weather's not turning for weeks yet." "I know," she said. "I'd rather do it before I need to than after." Something moved in his expression, the same small softening she was learning to recognize the fraction of an inch opening. "Fair enough," he said. She drank her coffee and went to work. It was 3 days later when she made her first real mistake on the ranch. She had been moving grain sacks in the barn, reorganizing the storage, the way she'd been slowly reorganizing every system she encountered on the property. And she had misjudged the weight of one, and it had come down off the upper shelf sideways, knocking into the barrel beneath it and sending a cascade of noise and grain and her own dignity directly onto the barn floor. She was standing in the mess, breathing hard, her skirt covered in grain dust, when Nathan appeared in the barn doorway. He looked at the grain, at the tipped barrel, at the sack now split at one seam, at her. She braced herself for the tone, for the "what were you thinking," for the specific, exhausted, disgusted, superior look that Samuel had perfected over years of her making mistakes. Nathan said, "You hurt." She blinked. "No. Good." He came into the barn, assessed the situation with a practical eye, and picked up the barrel. "I'll get the broom. That seam can be re-sewn if you catch it right. I've got a curved needle somewhere." He went for the broom. Elizabeth stood in the grain and felt something strange and tight behind her eyes. Not tears. She was not going to cry over a grain sack, but close to it the particular feeling of bracing for a blow that doesn't come, the body's confusion, when it has prepared itself for pain and received ordinary kindness instead. She picked up the grain sack and found the split seam and started pressing the edges together to assess the damage. And when Nathan came back with the broom, he handed it to her without comment and went to find the curved needle, and they cleaned up the mess together. Without a word said about fault or carelessness or the price of grain. That evening, Elizabeth re-sewed the seam on the grain sack with careful close stitches, and she thought about the barrel and the mess. And his first question, "You hurt," and she understood, not for the first time, and not for the last, that she was learning in this mountain cabin, what it felt like to be in a place where mistakes were just problems to solve, and not evidence of her fundamental inadequacy. On a Tuesday in the third week of August, Nathan came back from Harlan Ridge with news. He set his hat on the hook by the door and looked at her with the particular expression she was learning to read, as "there is something to tell you, and I am figuring out how." "Gerald Finch was in town," he said. Elizabeth set down the pot she was holding. "Here," she said. "In Harlan Ridge. At the saloon." Nathan sat down at the table. "I wasn't going to tell you. Then I thought you'd want to know." "What was he doing?" "Drinking," Nathan said. "And talking." He paused. "Talking about you." She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. "Tell me." He looked at her steadily. "He was telling anyone who'd listen that you ran away from home because you'd done something shameful. That you'd embarrassed your family. That you were hiding out on some mountain man's property and your brother was coming to set things right." The words landed like stones. She knew Samuel's tactics, had known them her whole life. First he'd send Gerald Finch to seed the story. Then he'd follow with the crowd already prepared to believe it. "He's laying the ground," she said. Nathan nodded. He'd understood it too. "How many people were listening?" she said. "Enough," he said. "Clara wasn't buying it. Couple of the other merchants neither, but enough," she said. "Yeah." She was quiet for a moment, thinking. Her hands were flat on the table, and she made herself keep them still. "What did you say to him?" she said. "Nothing," Nathan said. She looked up. "I don't explain myself to men who are drinking at noon," he said, without heat, just factually. "And I don't explain you." She stared at him. "Nathan, you're not a story I owe to strangers," he said. "What you want people to know about yourself is your business." She opened her mouth, closed it. Something was happening in her chest that she didn't quite have a name for yet. Something that felt like the floor becoming more solid under her feet, like the walls coming in a little closer, in the good way, the way that means shelter instead of confinement. "He'll be back," she said. "Probably," Nathan agreed. "And Samuel will come when he comes," Nathan said. "And you'll handle it the way you decide to handle it. And I'll be here. Just that. I'll be here." 4 words said the same way he said everything, quiet and level and absolutely certain, like a fence post set in good deep ground. Elizabeth looked at her hands on the table. "You keep doing that," she said quietly. "Doing what?" "Saying things like they're simple," she said. "Like they're easy." He was quiet for a moment. "They are simple," he said. "I didn't say easy." She looked at him. He held her gaze unhurried. "Simple and easy aren't the same thing," he said. "Right thing is usually simple. Doesn't mean it doesn't cost anything." She thought about that for a long time after he went out to check on the horses. Chamer. The merchant's name was Douglas Hale, and he had been operating his general store in Harlan Ridge for 11 years with a bookkeeping system that Elizabeth was fairly certain he had invented himself, possibly during a fever. She had spent her first 2 weeks quietly unraveling it, and her third week putting something sensible in its place, and Douglas Hale had spent that entire time alternating between impressed and slightly offended, the way men sometimes were when a woman turned out to be better at something than them. But he paid her fairly. He said so himself a little defensively on the morning he first handed her wages. "Fair wage for fair work," he said. "Same I'd pay anyone." Elizabeth counted the coins without letting her expression change. It was more than she had made mending clothes for 8 months. "Thank you, Mr. Hale," she said. "Douglas," he said gruffly, the way men say things they don't want to make a sentimental occasion. "Douglas," she said. She put the coins in her tin box and walked out into the Harlan Ridge morning sun and stood on the boardwalk for a moment with the box in her hand. "Your own money," Nathan had said. Like it was obvious, like it was owed. She bought 2 things on the way to the hitching post, a small paper of peppermint candy, because she wanted some, and a new ledger book, because she was going to need one. Then she rode back up the mountain. Clara waylaid her the next time she was in town, appearing at Elizabeth's elbow on the boardwalk outside the dry goods store, with the particular purposefulness of a woman who has decided to say a thing. "Gerald Finch is gone," Clara said without preamble. "Left 2 days ago. But he wasn't alone when he came." Elizabeth stopped walking. "Who was with him?" "A man I didn't know. And a boy from Willow Creek, one of the Greer boys, the younger one. They were here for 3 days." Clara's eyes were sharp and direct. "Asking questions. About Nathan mostly. About the ranch." "What kind of questions?" "Whether he had legal title to the land." Clara's voice was flat. "Whether there were any outstanding disputes on the property. Whether anyone had looked into it recently." Elizabeth felt something cold settle in her stomach. This was new. Samuel had shifted tactics from social pressure to legal threat. If he could manufacture a question about Nathan's land, he could create a reason to involve county authorities. He could turn a personal conflict into something official. It was exactly the kind of move Samuel would make. "Clara," she said, "does Nathan have clear title?" "Far as I know," Clara said. "He's been on that land since '73. Registered it proper far as anyone's heard." "Far as anyone's heard," Elizabeth repeated, which was not the same as far as the county recorder's office is concerned. Clara looked at her with frank assessment. "You're quick," she said. "I do accounts," Elizabeth said. "Numbers lie if the foundation is wrong." "So do titles," Clara said. She told Nathan that evening. She laid it out plainly. Gerald Finch, the unknown man, the Greer boy, the questions about his land title. She watched his face as she spoke, watched for the surprise, the alarm, the anger. What she saw instead was something that looked almost like recognition. "I've been waiting for something like this," he said quietly. She went still. "You have... Someone's been riding the east fence line," he said. 3 times in the past 2 weeks. I've seen tracks. Didn't want to say anything until I was sure." "Why didn't you tell me?" He looked at her with a directness that made her sit back slightly. "Because I wasn't sure it was connected to you," he said. "And I didn't want you to feel like your troubles brought danger to your door. They didn't. Whoever's doing this chose to make a choice. That's on them. She stared at him. Nathan, she said carefully, if someone is trying to manufacture a title dispute on your land because of me, that is my trouble at your door. It's my door, he said. My choice who stands at it. That's not... She stopped, pressed her hands flat on the table, started again. What is your title situation? Actually, do you know without any doubt that everything is recorded correctly with the county? He was quiet for a moment. I registered in 73, he said. Filed in Denver. Should be solid. Should be, she said, same tone she'd used with Clara. He looked at her steadily. Then he got up, went to the chest in the corner of the main room, and came back with a folder of papers. He set them in front of her. Tell me what you see, he said. She opened the folder. It took her an hour. Nathan sat across the table and drank coffee, and didn't say a word, which was exactly the right thing to do while someone was working through documents. What she found was mostly good. The original filing was clean. The boundary descriptions were clear, and the registration number was properly recorded. But there was one thing, a notation in the margin of the 1873 filing in different ink than the rest, that referenced a secondary claim. The notation was small, easy to miss. She would have missed it herself if she hadn't been looking for exactly this kind of thing. She put her finger on it. This, she said. Nathan leaned forward and looked. I've never seen that before, he said. Has anyone else had access to these papers? She said. They stay in that chest, he said. Only person besides me who's been in this cabin is you and... He stopped. She looked at him. A man came through last spring, he said slowly. Looking for work. I let him stay 3 days. He said he was heading north. Did you leave him alone in the cabin? A pause. Once, maybe twice. And the chest? Another pause longer. It doesn't lock, he said. She looked at the notation in the margin. Different ink. Careful handwriting. Someone planted this, she said. This notation references a claim that I would bet my wages doesn't actually exist. They added it to your document to create grounds for a dispute. She sat back. If someone files against your title and points to this, you'd have to prove it's fraudulent. And proving something is fraudulent costs money and time, and usually requires a lawyer. Nathan looked at the paper for a long moment. My lawyer's in Denver, he said. Can you reach him? It'll take a week for a letter to get there. Then write it tonight, she said. And I want to look at everything in that folder again tomorrow carefully, because if they put that notation there, they may have changed something else. Nathan looked across the table at her. You figured all that out in an hour, he said. I figured it out in 40 minutes, she said, then caught herself because that had come out with more edge than she intended. I'm sorry. I just numbers documents. I see things. Don't apologize for that, he said, and his voice had a particular quiet firmness to it that made her stop. Don't ever apologize for being good at something. She looked at him. Samuel used to say I was showing off, she said before she could stop herself. Samuel is wrong, Nathan said, simply, completely. She looked down at the papers. When she looked up, Nathan was still watching her with those dark, steady eyes, and he said, You've been taking care of yourself for a long time, haven't you? It wasn't quite a question. Since I was 16, she said. He nodded slowly like something was confirming itself. Well, he said, you don't have to do it alone anymore. She held those words for a moment, turned them over. You say things like they're simple, she said for the second time. I know, he said. Still true, though. The letter went to Denver the next morning. While they waited, Elizabeth went through every document in Nathan's folder twice more. Cross-referencing the boundary descriptions against the original county survey she located at the Harlan Ridge Land Office with Douglas Hale's help. The fraudulent notation was the only alteration she could find, but it was a significant one, carefully chosen to reference a specific section of Nathan's eastern boundary that would be difficult to verify without a physical survey. The eastern boundary, the same fence line where Nathan had been seeing tracks. She sat with that knowledge for most of a day, fitting pieces together, and by evening, she had a clear picture that she laid out for Nathan after supper. "Whoever is behind this knows your land," she said. "The man who came through last spring, he wasn't just looking for work. He was mapping your property and looking for the weakest point in your boundary documentation." Nathan's jaw was tight. The eastern edge runs along an old creek bed that dried up. Boundaries get complicated when the natural markers change. Which means any challenge there would be expensive to refute and easy to string out in court, she said. "They're not trying to win. They're trying to make it cost more than you can afford to fight." "At which point I'd have to sell off land or livestock to pay the legal fees," Nathan said, "or abandon the challenge and let the fraudulent claim stand." He was very still. "How much would it cost to fight it?" she said. "I don't know exactly. Lawyers' fees, survey costs, travel to Denver for the proceedings." He did the math in his head. She could see it on his face. "More than I've got in hand, not more than I could get if I sold the—" He stopped. "If you sold what?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "The South Pasture," he said. "I've been thinking about expanding it. There's a man in Harlan Ridge who's offered to buy the timber rights instead, which would—" He stopped again. "It doesn't matter. That's my problem to solve." "Nathan," she said. "It's my land," he said, not unkindly but firmly. "My problem." She looked at him. She thought about every time Samuel had used money as a lever, had controlled her life through the simple fact of controlling the resources, keeping her dependent and therefore manageable. She was not going to let Nathan's land go the same way. "I have wages coming from Douglas Hale," she said, "and savings from before. Not enough to cover everything, but—" "Elizabeth." His voice was quiet and absolutely final. "No. It's my money," she said. "I choose how." "I know it's your money," he said. "That's why I'm saying no. You don't spend your savings on my land dispute." "You said we—" "There's no we in this," he said, and it landed like a door closing just for a moment before he said more quietly, "Not like that. I won't take your money." She sat back. They looked at each other across the table. "Then figure out another way," she said finally. "Because I'm not watching you lose this land to a fraudulent claim without doing everything possible to fight it." Something moved across his face, something complex and undefended and brief. "All right," he said. The solution came from Douglas Hale of all people. Elizabeth mentioned carefully, professionally, without detail, that Nathan was dealing with a potential land title dispute and needed documentation verified quickly. Douglas Hale, who had lived in Harlan Ridge for 11 years and knew everyone connected to county government within a 2-day ride, immediately said, "Abe Whitmore." "Who?" Elizabeth said. "Circuit recorder. He comes through Harlan Ridge every 6 weeks. He's due in 10 days. Best man in the territory with title documents. If there's been tampering, Abe will see it, and his word is gold with the Denver Land Office." Douglas looked at her over his own ledger. "And he doesn't charge by the hour." She rode back up the mountain faster than usual. Nathan was at the fence line when she arrived. She could see him at the far edge of the east pasture, checking posts, the way she'd watched him check posts before, methodical, hands-on, one post at a time. She crossed the pasture toward him, and he turned when he heard the mare and watched her come with that particular still attention of his. She told him about Abe Whitmore before she'd even properly dismounted. Nathan was quiet for a moment, turning it over. 10 days, he said. 10 days, she confirmed. He looked at the fence line, then back at her. "You went to Hale's," he said. "I was there for accounts," she said. "I mentioned it in passing." He studied her face like he was reading a document and trying to decide which parts were technically accurate and which parts were leaving things out. "In passing," he said. "In passing." She repeated, meeting his eyes with complete serenity. His mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile, but wanted to be. "Thank you," he said. "You're welcome," she said. "And before you say anything, I didn't spend any money." Now the almost smile fully lost the battle and became an actual one, brief and real and startling in its suddenness, on a face she had learned to read as habitually composed. She had not seen him smile before, not a real one. She looked away before he caught her looking, pretending to check her mare's bridle. Her heart was doing something unexpected, and she chose not to examine it closely. The next 10 days should have been ordinary. They weren't. 3 things happened in quick succession that together shifted the ground under everything Elizabeth thought she understood about her situation. The first was a conversation with a woman named Harriet Oakes, who ran the seamstress shop at the far end of Harlan Ridge's Main Street, and who stopped Elizabeth on a Wednesday morning, with the air of someone who had been building up to this for a while. "I heard what Gerald Finch said about you," Harriet Oakes said straightforward as a fence post. "It's not true, is it?" It wasn't a question either. "No," Elizabeth said. "It's not." Harriet looked at her with steady gray eyes. "I've been watching you come and go for 3 weeks. You do Douglas Hale's accounts, you do the ordering at the feed store, you don't drink, and you don't idle, and you help Clara carry things when her back is bad." She paused. "That's not the behavior of a woman who ran away from something shameful. That's the behavior of a woman who ran toward something better." Elizabeth looked at her. "Thank you," she said, and meant it more than Harriet Oakes could probably know. "I'm just saying what's true," Harriet said briskly. "And I plan to keep saying it in case your brother actually comes here and tries to tell a different story." She walked back into her shop and left Elizabeth standing on the boardwalk with her chest full of something she would spend the rest of the day trying to name. Not gratitude exactly, though it was that. Not relief, though it was that too. Something more like proof. Proof that there were people in this world who saw clearly and said what they saw. That Samuel's version of Elizabeth Carter was not the only version. That the version she was building here in this mountain town in this summer of hard work and earned wages, and a man who said simply and not easily that version was being witnessed. The second thing happened 5 days later, and it came out of nowhere. She and Nathan had been mending the east fence together. She'd been handed a post-hole digger 3 days earlier, with a brief demonstration, and the words, "Try it, and see which she had," and her shoulders had complained for 2 days. But she was getting the technique now. They had been working in companionable quiet for most of the morning, when Nathan, without looking up from the wire he was stretching, said, "Margaret used to say I kept things too close." Elizabeth went still. She kept her hands on the post she was steadying and said nothing, because she had learned that Nathan Cole said the things he meant to say at the speed he intended to say them, and interrupting was the same as slamming a door. "She said I'd wait till something was already wrong to deal with it," he continued, still working the wire voice level. "Because dealing with it before meant admitting I was worried about it. And admitting worry felt—" He paused. "Like weakness." He finally looked up at her. "She was right," he said. Elizabeth held his gaze. "Why are you telling me this?" she said gently. He looked back at the wire. "Because I've been seeing those tracks on the east fence for 2 weeks, and I told you about them when you told me about Finch." He paused. "Not before." "You were waiting to be sure," she said. "I was waiting because telling you would make it more real," he said. "And I didn't want it to be." He pulled the wire tight and wrapped it around the new post with practiced hands. "You had enough to carry," he said more quietly. "I didn't want to add mine." Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment, looking at the side of his face, at the concentration in it, the steadiness, and underneath that, the thing she was beginning to see more clearly, the careful, deliberate way he moved through the world, like a man who had learned not to put weight on anything until he was sure it would hold. "You can tell me things," she said. "When they're real, and before they're real, and anywhere in between." He looked at her. "I know," he said. "I mean it," she said. "This works." She gestured between them at the fence at the ranch visible over his shoulder. "All of this, the work of it. It works better when both people know what's actually happening." He was quiet for a moment. "You sound like Margaret," he said. She didn't know what to do with that exactly. but she thought it was probably meant as something close to the finest compliment he knew how to give. She was a smart woman, Elizabeth said. Yeah? Nathan said. She was. He went back to the wire. She went back to the post. The mountain morning continued around them unhurried. The third thing was Samuel. Not in person, not yet. But a second letter arrived at the Harlan Ridge post office on a Friday morning, and this one was addressed not to Elizabeth, but to Nathan Cole. Clara brought it up the mountain herself, which told Elizabeth before she even opened the door that it was serious. Came with the stage, Clara said, handing it over, looking between them with an expression that was careful and unsentimental and kind. I didn't open it. Nathan took it, read his own name on the envelope, looked at Elizabeth. Do you want to read it first? He said. Open it, she said. He opened it. He read it without his expression changing, which she had come to understand was not the same as not feeling it. When he finished, he set it on the table and pushed it toward her. She read it standing up. Samuel Carter. It turned out could write to men differently than he wrote to his sister. The letter to Nathan was formal and deliberate and dangerous in the particular way of a man who had spoken to a lawyer or someone who wanted to sound like he had. It stated in careful language that Elizabeth Carter had left Willow Creek under circumstances that constituted abandonment of a contractual arrangement made on her behalf. That Gerald Finch had standing to pursue recovery of certain damages. That Nathan Cole, by harboring Elizabeth without notification to her family, had made himself party to her breach of that arrangement. That Samuel intended to arrive in Harlan Ridge within the fortnight to resolve the matter, and that he expected Nathan to have Elizabeth prepared to return with him. Elizabeth's hands were very still on the paper. Contractual arrangement, she said. He sold you to Finch, Nathan said. Flat, no flinching from the words. He sold something, she said. Whether he had the right to is another question. He didn't, Nathan said. No, she said. He didn't. She set the letter down. Her hands were steady. But he's going to stand in front of people and say he did. He can say what he wants, Nathan said. Doesn't make it true. She looked at him. It doesn't have to be true to work, Nathan. If he comes here with the right story and the right people listening, then we'll have the right people listening too, Nathan said. She looked at the letter. He's coming, she said. You said he would. I know. She pressed her hands flat on the table, feeling the solid wood beneath her palms, grounding herself. I need you to understand something. When he comes, he is very convincing. To people who don't know him, he has a way of seeming like the reasonable one. I've met men like that, Nathan said. He'll call me difficult. He'll say I'm confused. He'll make it sound like he's just a concerned brother who wants his sister safe. Her voice was even. He's been saying those things my whole life. Some people will believe him. Nathan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Are you afraid of him? She considered the question seriously. I was, she said. For a long time I was afraid of him every day. Afraid of his moods, afraid of his words, afraid of what he would do if I... She stopped, steadied. I'm not afraid of him the same way anymore, but I'm afraid of what he can do to the things I've built. She looked around the cabin, at the reorganized kitchen, at the ledger she'd fixed at the curtain, she'd hemmed at the small jar of wildflowers she'd put on the windowsill 3 days ago for no practical reason, except that she'd wanted them there. He'll try to take this, she said. Nathan followed her gaze around the cabin. Then he looked back at her. He can try, he said, and in his voice was something so absolutely grounded, so certain without being loud about it, that Elizabeth Carter, who had been taking care of herself since she was 16 years old and had gotten very good at not needing anyone, felt that thing in her chest that had been loosening slowly since she arrived on this mountain, felt it loosen one more crucial turn. I'll write to Abe Whitmore tonight, she said. I want him to have everything about the title documentation before Samuel arrives. Good, Nathan said. And I want to go through your papers one more time. All right. And I think you should talk to the sheriff in Harlan Ridge. Already planned to, he said. She blinked. When did you plan that? When you told me Finch was in town asking about my title, he said. I was going to go this week. She stared at him. You didn't say anything. You were already ahead of me, he said, and the corner of his mouth moved. Didn't seem like you needed the company. She looked at him for a long moment. This quiet, careful, deliberate man who said things simply because he meant them simply, who had lost his wife and his child, and rebuilt himself into something solid and unhurried, who had written, "Come in a letter to a stranger," because he recognized in her words someone who asked for the right thing. Nathan, she said. Yeah, he said. I'm glad I came, she said. He looked at her steadily for a moment. So am I, he said. Outside, the summer afternoon was going gold the way it did on this mountain. Generously, the light spreading slow and warm across the pasture and the fence line, and the faces of two people sitting at a table, figuring out how to hold something worth holding. Samuel Carter was coming, and for the first time in her life, Elizabeth Carter was not going to run. Abe Whitmore arrived in Harlan Ridge 9 days later, 2 days ahead of schedule, which Elizabeth took as either very good luck or a sign that the universe had decided to cooperate for once. He was older than she had expected, a compact, white-haired man with ink-stained fingers and the unhurried manner of someone who had spent 40 years looking at documents and had learned that patience was the only tool that never wore out. Douglas Hale brought him directly to the ranch, which Elizabeth had not asked him to do, but was deeply grateful for, and Nathan met them at the fence gate with a handshake and the folder of papers. And within 20 minutes, Abe Whitmore was sitting at the kitchen table with every document spread in front of him, and his spectacles on his nose, and the expression of a man who has found something professionally offensive. That notation, he said, pointing to the marginal addition Elizabeth had found, is not in the original filing ink. I can tell by the shade and by the pen pressure. Someone added this after the fact. He looked up at Nathan over his spectacles. You're aware this constitutes document fraud? We are, Nathan said. You have any idea who did it? We have a strong suspicion, Elizabeth said, but not proof of the person who physically altered it. We know who sent him. Abe looked at her. She had been introduced as the person who had found the discrepancy, and Abe Whitmore had the rare quality of looking at her the same way he looked at Nathan as a source of accurate information. The man who has a motivation to create a title dispute on this property, she said carefully, is arriving in Harlan Ridge within the next week. He is my brother. He is also attempting to compel me to return to Willow Creek against my will, and the title dispute is likely intended as leverage. Abe looked at her for a moment, then at Nathan, then back at the documents. Well, he said, let's make sure his leverage doesn't hold. He spent 3 hours at that table. Elizabeth brought coffee and sat across from him when he had questions about the account records she'd cross-referenced, and Nathan answered everything about the property boundaries with the patient precision of a man who had walked every inch of his own land. By the time Abe Whitmore closed the folder and took off his spectacles, the light had shifted to late afternoon, and the coffee pot was empty. Your title is solid, Abe said. The notation is fraudulent, and I'll put that in writing today. I'll file a corrected record with the Denver Land Office before the week is out. He looked at Nathan. If anyone tries to press a claim based on that notation after my certification, they'll be filing against a documented fraud. That's a different kind of trouble than they bargained for. Nathan nodded once. And the man coming, Abe said, looking at Elizabeth. He'll know this when he arrives. He'll know, Elizabeth said, when someone tells him. She told Nathan that night that she wanted to be the one to tell Samuel. Not at the ranch. Not on Nathan's ground in Nathan's cabin with Samuel able to look around and claim she had been influenced or manipulated or confined. She wanted to meet him in Harlan Ridge in public, in a place where everything that was said could be witnessed. You don't have to do it alone, Nathan said. I know, she said. I want you there. I just need to be the one who speaks. He looked at her across the table. All right, he said. You might have things you want to say to him, she said. And I understand that. But, Elizabeth, His voice was quiet and very level. "I have exactly one thing to say to your brother, and I'll say it if he gives me cause. Until then, I'll stand there and let you handle it." She looked at him. "What's the one thing?" He looked back at her with those dark, steady eyes. "That she's not going anywhere," he said. "Simple as that." She held that for a moment. "All right," she said. She slept better that night than she had in 2 weeks. Samuel Carter rode into Harlan Ridge on a Tuesday morning with Gerald Finch beside him and a man Elizabeth didn't recognize riding slightly behind someone with the careful, watchful look of a man paid to be present rather than to speak. She saw them from the window of Douglas Hale's store, where she had positioned herself deliberately, and she had a moment, just one, just a breath's worth of the old feeling. The thing her body remembered before her mind did the particular contraction in her chest that 6 years of Samuel Carter had installed in her like a mechanism, triggered by the sight of his straight back and his hat, and the way he held the reins, like he held everything with the assumption that it was his to control. She breathed through it. Then she stood up straight, smoothed her skirt, said, "Excuse me, Douglas," and walked out the front door. Nathan was already across the street, standing in front of the hardware store with his thumbs in his belt, not obviously watching anything in particular. He met her eyes briefly as she came out. She gave a small nod. He stayed where he was. Samuel saw her when she was 20 feet away. He pulled up his horse. His face did the thing she remembered. The quick assessment, the recalibration, the settling into the expression he used when he needed to appear reasonable. "Elizabeth," he said. He made it sound like relief. "Samuel," she said, stopping at a comfortable distance. Gerald Finch was watching her with the expression of a man who considers himself owed something. She did not look at him long enough to give him the satisfaction of her attention. "You look well," Samuel said, which meant you look like someone I need to reclaim before people get the wrong idea. "I am well," she said. "Thank you for making the trip. I'd like to settle this here." "Settle what?" Samuel said. "There's nothing to settle. You're coming home." "I'm not," she said. He swung down from his horse with the unhurried movements of a man who has decided to be patient. She recognized that too, the specific patience he deployed when he was planning to wear someone down. "Elizabeth." His voice was measured, almost gentle, the voice he used in public. "I understand you were upset. But you've had time to think clearly now, and I need you to understand that what you've done, running off, living with a man you don't know, putting the family name in people's mouths." "I haven't done anything to the family name," she said. "Gerald Finch has done considerably more telling stories about me in saloons." Samuel's expression tightened just slightly. "Gerald was trying to find you," he said. "Gerald was telling anyone who'd listen that I ran away from something shameful," she said. "Which isn't true. Which I think you know isn't true. You ran away from a good arrangement." "I ran away from being sold," she said. The word landed on the street between them. A woman coming out of the seamstress shop stopped walking. A man at the edge of the boardwalk turned slightly as if he hadn't been listening, and now was. Samuel's jaw worked for a moment. "That is an outrageous thing to say," he said. "Gerald Finch is a decent man from a decent family, and I made an arrangement that was in your best—" "You made an arrangement," she said, "without asking me, without telling me. And when I said no, you told me it wasn't a request." She kept her voice level, the way she'd been practicing it in her head for a week. "I have a right to say no, Samuel. I have always had that right. You never thought I did, but I did." "You are my sister," he said, "and you are my responsibility, and—" "I am 26 years old," she said. "I am not your property, and I am not your responsibility. I am a grown woman who keeps accounts for 3 businesses in this town, who has her own wages, and her own savings, and her own choices." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not coming back to Willow Creek. I'm not marrying Gerald Finch, and I'm not having this argument again." Samuel looked at her for a long moment. Then he changed tactics. She could see it happen, the subtle shift, the decision to move to another weapon. "You can't stay here," he said. There are questions about this man's land, about whether he actually owns what he says he... There were questions, said a voice. Abe Whitmore was standing in the doorway of the land office, which was also in Harlan Ridge, the same building as the post office and the county records annex. He stepped out onto the boardwalk with his spectacles on his nose and a sheaf of papers in his hand. "I'm the circuit recorder for this district," he said to the general group, but specifically to Samuel. "I've certified Nathan Cole's title this morning. His claim is clean, the boundaries are registered correctly, and any marginal notation suggesting otherwise has been documented as a later fraudulent addition to the original filing." He looked at Samuel over his spectacles. If someone were to file a claim based on that notation, they'd be filing on documented fraud. That's a federal matter. Samuel stared at him. "I don't know what you're referring to," Samuel said. "No," Abe said pleasantly. "I don't expect you do." He went back inside. Samuel's face had gone carefully neutral, the neutrality of someone doing rapid internal calculations. Elizabeth watched him and recognized the calculation and knew that this was not over because Samuel Carter did not retreat. He regrouped. "Elizabeth," he said more quietly now, shifting to personal. "I am your family. Whatever you think of me, whatever has been said to you here by people who don't know our history, I am the only family you have. Mama would not have wanted this." There it was. There was always a moment when he got to her mother. She felt the old pain move through her, the particular grief that was always there underneath everything, and for a moment it was difficult to breathe around it. But she had been ready for this too. "Mama would have wanted me safe," she said. "Mama would have wanted me treated with dignity. She would not have wanted me sold to a man I didn't choose to pay off whatever you owe Gerald Finch." The air went very still. Samuel's eyes changed. "What did you just say?" he said. She had guessed. She had put the pieces together over 2 weeks of quiet thinking. Gerald Finch's eagerness, Samuel's unusual urgency, the formal language about damages, and breach of contractual arrangement. She had guessed, but she had not been certain. Samuel's face told her she was right. "You owe him money," she said, keeping her voice level, even though her heart was hitting the inside of her ribs. "This isn't about family or my reputation or Mama's wishes. You made a debt you couldn't pay, and you offered me as part of the settlement." Samuel's face had gone very still and very cold. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said. "How much?" she said. "Elizabeth, how much do you owe him, Samuel?" The street was very quiet. From across the way, without moving from where he stood, Nathan said quietly to the general air, not to anyone in particular, "A man who settles his debts with his sister's life isn't owed anything but shame." Samuel turned toward Nathan with the full force of 6 years of accumulated fury directed somewhere new. "This doesn't concern you," he said. Nathan looked at him with those dark, steady eyes. "She concerns me," he said. "That makes it my business." Samuel took 2 steps toward him. Gerald Finch dropped down from his horse. Elizabeth stepped forward. "Don't," she said. Samuel stopped. She was between them now, not hiding behind Nathan, not pulling Nathan forward, just standing where she needed to stand. "You can be angry at me," she said to Samuel, looking directly at him. "You've always been angry at me. That's your right. But there is nothing you can do here that gets you what you came for. I'm not going back. The debt you owe Gerald Finch is a debt you made, and you'll have to find another way to settle it." She kept her voice even. "I'm sorry if that's hard. I genuinely am. But I am done paying for your choices with mine." Samuel looked at her. In his eyes, she saw something she had never seen directed at her before. Not fury, not contempt, not the withering certainty that she was wrong and small and would eventually understand that. What she saw was shock. The specific shock of someone who has been operating on an assumption for years and has just discovered the assumption was false. He had believed she understood that she would fold. He had believed it so completely that he had ridden all the way from Willow Creek without seriously considering that she wouldn't. Cug. Gerald Finch chose that moment to speak. He had been quiet through most of the exchange, which was not the Gerald Finch she remembered from Willow Creek, where he was loud and assured and accustomed to having his opinions treated as facts. He had been watching her and Nathan and the street with the look of a man reassessing his position. When he spoke, he addressed Nathan directly. "Cole," he said, "I've got a legal arrangement that involves this woman. You're interfering with a legitimate—" "What's the arrangement?" said a new voice. Sheriff Tom Bridle had come out of his office, which was 4 doors down from where they were standing. He had the easy, unhurried walk of a man who had been sheriff long enough not to need to rush. He stopped at the edge of the group and looked at Gerald Finch with mild professional attention. "Legal arrangement," he said. "What kind?" Gerald Finch looked at Samuel. Samuel looked at Gerald Finch. "Between this woman and myself," Finch said. "Her brother arranged—" "Did she sign anything?" the sheriff said. A pause. "Her brother." "I didn't ask about her brother," the sheriff said. "Did she sign anything?" Another pause. Longer. "No," Finch said. "Then you don't have an arrangement," the sheriff said. "You have an expectation." He looked at Elizabeth with the calm, matter-of-fact regard of a man doing his job. "You being held here against your will, ma'am?" "No," she said. "You want to go back to Willow Creek?" "No," she said. He nodded, as if that was all the information he required, which as far as he was concerned, it was. "Gentlemen," he said to Samuel and Finch, "I'd recommend you get a meal, rest your horses, and head back the way you came. There's no legal basis for what you're describing, and if you try to create one, I'll be considerably less pleasant to talk to." He looked at the third man, the quiet, watchful one who still hadn't spoken. "You too, friend." The quiet man nodded and looked at his horse. Samuel was very still. Elizabeth watched her brother's face and waited for the next move, because there was always a next move with Samuel. He had not ridden this far to turn around quietly. He surprised her. He looked at her not with anger, not with the cold, calculated patience, but with something she hadn't expected and didn't quite know what to do with. "I needed the money, Elizabeth," he said. It was the closest thing to a true statement she had heard him make in years. "The farm is mortgaged. There's nothing left." She looked at him. "That's not my fault," she said quietly. "No," he said. "I know." The admission was small, inadequate. 6 years of control and contempt, and one morning in a general store that had broken something in her that took 2 years to admit was broken, and he was giving her "I know." But it was something. She held it for a moment, turned it over. "I'm not coming back," she said. "That's not going to change. But the farm—" She paused. Let herself think for a moment, rather than just feel. "There may be options you haven't considered. I can help you think through them if you want. As a letter, not in person." Samuel stared at her. "You'd do that," he said. "I'm good with numbers," she said. "You know that. You just always wished I wasn't." Something crossed his face that she couldn't fully read. Not quite shame, not quite grief. Something in the neighborhood of both. Gerald Finch had gone very quiet. The sheriff was watching the whole exchange with the patience of a man who has seen most of what people do to each other and has learned not to be surprised. "I'm going to ride back today," Samuel said finally. "All right," she said. "Finch," Samuel said without looking at him. Finch looked like he had several things he wanted to say, and had calculated that none of them would help him. "Cole," he said instead to Nathan. "No hard feelings." Nathan looked at him with those dark, steady, completely unimpressed eyes. "Go home, Finch," he said. Finch went home. Down. The third man, the quiet, watchful one, lingered for just a moment after the others had remounted. He was looking at Nathan, and there was something in his look that Elizabeth caught and filed away, not hostility, but a measuring quality, like he was seeing something he hadn't expected. Then he tipped his hat once to Elizabeth specifically and rode away. She turned to Nathan. "Do you know who that was?" she said. "No," he said. "But I'd like to." She looked after the retreating horses. "He wasn't there for Samuel," she said slowly. "He didn't ride with them. He rode behind them. And he wasn't listening to Samuel the whole time. He was watching you. Nathan was quiet. Someone sent him, she said. Someone wanted to see how this went. Yeah, Nathan said. Who? I don't know yet, he said. But I intend to find out. Clara's eating house was full at noon, which was not unusual. But the quality of the conversation was, everyone seemed to have been watching or to have heard from someone who had been watching. And the story was moving through the room in the efficient way of small-town information, which was to say immediately and with embellishments. Elizabeth sat at a corner table with Nathan and Douglas Hale and drank coffee and let the conversation wash around her, which was warm and mostly on her side, and tried to figure out why she felt unsettled rather than relieved. You all right? Nathan said quietly under the noise of the room. I'm thinking, she said. About the third man, she said. Douglas Hale, who had been listening while pretending not to look up from his coffee. Which third man? There were 3 with Samuel, she said. One was Finch. One was a man from Willow Creek. The third one, nobody's mentioned him. Nobody seems to know him. Douglas Hale frowned. What did he look like? She described him, the watchful eyes, the way he'd positioned himself behind the others, the fact that he'd tipped his hat specifically to her at the end. Douglas was quiet for a moment. Sounds like it might be Pete Greer, he said slowly. Elizabeth went still. Clara mentioned a Greer boy, one of the ones who came with Finch to ask about Nathan's title. That'd be the younger one, Douglas said. Pete. He's about 25, works whatever job pays. He paused. He was in here asking about Nathan's land last month, but he was also asking about something else. What else? Nathan said. Douglas looked between them. He was asking about the McCready claim, he said. The piece of land that runs up against your east boundary. Old Silas McCready died 2 years ago with no direct heirs. Land's been sitting in probate. He picked up his coffee. Your east boundary dispute, Nathan. I don't think Samuel Carter started it. I think someone else did, and Samuel just got used. The eating house went on around them, cheerful and noisy. Elizabeth and Nathan looked at each other. Someone else wants the McCready land, she said. And the easiest way to get it, Nathan said slowly, is to cloud my title to the east boundary, force a dispute, and buy up both parcels in the confusion. Who has the money to do that? She said. Douglas Hale looked uncomfortable. There's a man who's been buying up land in this valley for the past 3 years, he said, quietly, through intermediaries. He doesn't come to Harlan Ridge himself. He set his cup down. His name is Carlisle, Daniel Carlisle. He's got an office in Denver, and he's got a reputation for finding land in probate and making the complications around it disappear. The name landed in Elizabeth's chest like a stone dropped in still water. Daniel Carlisle, she said. You know him? Nathan said. No, she said. But I know the type. She thought of Samuel's ledger before she'd corrected it. She thought of Douglas Hale's accounting system before she'd rebuilt it. She thought of what she knew from 6 years of watching her brother about men who used numbers as weapons. He's been running this from Denver. Samuel was a distraction. Finch was a distraction. The title dispute was the point. Nathan was very still across the table. He's coming, he said. Not a question. He or someone he sends, she said. When Samuel's threat didn't hold when Abe Whitmore certified your title, the distraction failed. Which means he'll move to the next thing. She looked at Nathan. What's the next thing? Nathan was quiet for a moment. If the title dispute is dead, he said slowly, the next leverage is the loan. She frowned. What loan? He looked at her, then at Douglas, then back at her. I took a loan 4 years ago, he said, to rebuild the barn after the fire, from a lending office in Denver. She felt something cold move through her. Which lending office? She said. He said the name. Douglas Hale closed his eyes briefly. That's one of Carlisle's, he said. The ride back up to the ranch was quiet and fast, and Elizabeth spent the whole of it going through numbers in her head. The loan amount, the repayment schedule she'd seen in Nathan's papers, the amount outstanding, the current date, the terms. When they got to the cabin, she went directly to the folder and found the loan documentation and spread it on the table and went through every line. Nathan stood beside her and watched and didn't say anything. She found it in 5 minutes. She almost wished she hadn't. "There's an acceleration clause," she said. "What does that mean?" "It means that under certain conditions the lender can call the full balance of the loan immediately, rather than letting you pay it out over time." She put her finger on the relevant section. "Look at this condition. In the event of any cloud on the title of the secured property, the lender may, at his discretion, demand full repayment within 30 days. Nathan read it again. "A cloud on the title," he said. "Which they created," she said. "The fraudulent notation. They added it to your title document, which created a cloud which triggered this clause, which lets them demand immediate full repayment." She sat back. "It doesn't matter that Abe Whitmore certified the title this morning. The clause was triggered before the certification. If Carlisle's people file on it today." "How much?" Nathan said. She told him. He was very quiet. It was not a number she could cover. It was not a number Nathan could cover without liquidating significant assets, the south pasture he'd mentioned, possibly livestock, possibly the timber rights. "When did they plan to file?" she said. "I don't know," he said. "We need to know," she said. "Because if we have time before they file, Abe Whitmore's certification changes things. But if they filed before he certified—" "I'll ride to Denver," Nathan said. She looked at him. "That's 3 days." "Then I'll leave tonight," he said. "Nathan, Elizabeth." He looked at her with those dark, certain eyes. "This is my land. I've been on it for 13 years. I built every fence post out there, and I know every foot of that east boundary, and I am not going to lose it to a man in Denver who's never set foot here because he found a clever clause in a loan document." She looked at him. She thought about the fence posts she'd seen him check, the ledger she'd found and fixed, the old photograph on the shelf, the way he'd said Margaret in the firelight. This land was not just property. It was where he had survived things that should have broken him. "I'm coming with you," she said. "You don't have to." "I know," she said. "I'm coming anyway." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read, something open and complicated and briefly unguarded. "All right," he said. She was already moving toward her room to pack. "Elizabeth," he said. She turned. "You found the clause," he said. "I wouldn't have seen it." "You might have," she said. "Not in time," he said. She held his gaze. "That's what I'm here for," she said. "Among other things." He nodded once slowly. "Yeah," he said. "I know." She turned back toward her room, and she was already thinking. Denver, 3 days. Carlisle's office, what she knew about how men like Carlisle operated, what Abe Whitmore's certification meant as a legal document, whether there was a lawyer in Denver who could— Elizabeth. She stopped again. "He said I know," Nathan said. "Your brother. When you said the farm's failure wasn't your fault." She turned slowly. "Yeah," she said. "He did." Was that the first time? She thought about it honestly. "Yes," she said. Nathan nodded. "Good," he said. "Not as in good that's settled, but as in good that you know that. Good that you have it." She went to pack, and the mountain evening came down around the cabin, and somewhere in Denver, a man named Daniel Carlisle did not yet know that the woman who had reorganized every system she touched and the man who had built every fence post on his own land were riding toward him. He would know soon. They rode out before sunrise. Nathan had the horses ready before Elizabeth finished packing, which was saying something because she had packed in 12 minutes just what was necessary. Nothing extra, the same discipline she'd applied to everything since leaving Willow Creek. When she came out of her room with her bag, he handed her a biscuit wrapped in cloth and a canteen without comment, and they were moving down the mountain trail before the first light touched the peaks. She ate the biscuit on horseback and thought about acceleration clauses. Nathan rode beside her on the wider sections of trail and ahead of her on the narrow ones, and neither of them spoke much in the early dark, which was fine. She had learned that Nathan's silences were working silences. He was thinking the same way she was thinking, just in different directions. She was thinking about documents and loan terms, and what a Denver lawyer would need to build a case against Carlisle's acceleration demand. He was, she suspected, thinking about the land itself. The fence posts, the east boundary, the creek bed that had dried up and left his title vulnerable to exactly this kind of attack. When they reached the main road and the horses settled into a steadier rhythm, Nathan said, "Tell me everything you know about how this works, the legal side." So she told him. She laid it out the way she'd lay out a set of accounts. Here is what we have, here is what we owe, here is where the numbers don't reconcile. The loan was 4 years old. The outstanding balance was significant, but not unpayable. Over time, the problem was the acceleration clause, which compressed time into something they couldn't manage without selling assets. Carlisle's people had engineered the title cloud specifically to trigger that clause. The question was whether the cloud had legally existed long enough to count, because Abe Whitmore's certification said the notation was fraudulent from the moment it was added, which meant the cloud itself was fraudulent, which meant the trigger for the acceleration clause was built on fraud. So, if we can prove the clause was triggered by a fraudulent act, she said, the acceleration may not hold. Can we prove that in time? He said. We can prove it, she said. Whether we can prove it before Carlisle files is the question. Nathan was quiet for a moment. How long have we got? He said. I don't know, she said. That's what we need to find out first thing when we get to Denver. He rode in silence for a while. Then, you've done this kind of thing before, untangled something that someone else made complicated on purpose. With numbers, yes, she said. This is the same, he said. Someone made a mess of something simple. You find where it went wrong, and you correct it. She looked at him. You're not worried, she said. It wasn't quite an accusation. More like an observation she was trying to understand. I'm worried, he said. I just don't let worry do the driving. She turned that over, stored it somewhere useful. All right, she said. Then let's talk about what we're walking into. Denver was 3 days of hard riding, and they made it in 2.5 because Nathan knew the mountain routes, and Elizabeth did not complain once about pace or discomfort, which he noticed without saying so. They slept 2 nights at roadside stops. She had her own room both times, and he paid for both without discussion. And she let him without the defensive reflex she would have had 2 months ago, because she was learning the difference between control and care. The difference she was discovering was whether someone asked you afterward what you needed. Nathan always asked. Samuel never had. Denver hit them both differently than Harlan Ridge. Bigger, louder, the particular noise of a city that had decided it was important and was proving it at high volume. Elizabeth had been to the nearest large town near Willow Creek a handful of times, but this was different in scale and speed, and she felt for the first time slightly out of her depth, which was an uncomfortable feeling for a woman who prided herself on reading situations quickly. Nathan moved through it without difficulty, which surprised her until she remembered he'd been coming to Denver for 13 years to file land papers and sell cattle and do the business of a working ranch. First stop, she said, is the county records office. I need to see whether Carlisle filed on the acceleration clause. I know a lawyer, Nathan said. His name is Robert Ames. He's handled my land filing since the beginning. We should go to him first. She considered. Both at once would be faster. He looked at her. Split up, he said. You go to Ames, I go to the records office, she said. You know Ames, he'll talk to you faster than to me. I know what to look for in the records. Nathan held her gaze for a moment. You know Denver, he said. No, she admitted. But I know how records offices work. They're all the same. Another moment. County building is on Larimer, he said. Big stone front. Ask for the land records annex, it's on the 2nd floor. He paused. If Carlisle has filed anything, it'll be under Col N, or under the property designation. You'll need the parcel number. He reached into his vest pocket and handed her a folded paper. It's there. She took it, looked at it, looked at him. 2 hours, she said. Back here. 2 hours, he agreed. She turned and walked toward Larimer Street, and he watched her go for exactly 1 second before he turned toward Ames's office, because standing there watching her walk away felt like a thing he needed to stop doing before it became a habit he'd have to examine. The Land Records Annex was exactly the same as every records office she had ever encountered. Underfunded, overstocked, and staffed by a single clerk who looked at her the way clerks always looked at women, who came in alone, asking for technical documents, which was with the specific weary skepticism of someone who expected to spend 15 minutes explaining something basic. She gave him the parcel number and asked for any filings in the past 30 days. He went away, came back with 2 folders. She opened the first one. Routine. East boundary confirmation consistent with what Abe had already certified. She opened the second. Her hands went very still. Carlisle had filed. 4 days ago, the day after Abe Whitmore had certified Nathan's title, the day after Samuel Carter had ridden away from Harlan Ridge. The timing was not coincidental. The timing was surgical. The filing invoked the acceleration clause and demanded full repayment within 30 days of the filing date, citing the marginal title notation as the triggering cloud. It had been filed by a law firm she didn't recognize, but the attorney of record was listed as a man named J. Hartwell Crane. She read the document 3 times the way she'd read Samuel's letter once, for information once, to check that she'd gotten it right once to decide what to do. Then she asked the clerk for a copy, which he charged her 20 cents, for which she paid without comment, and she walked back to meet Nathan with the paper in her hand and 26 days left on the clock. Robert Ames was a small, dry-voiced man, with the energy of someone who had been doing difficult things for a long time, and had gotten very good at hiding how much they cost him. He looked at Abe Whitmore's certification at the loan document at the Carlisle filing, and at Elizabeth, who had come with Nathan, who had introduced her as the person who found the discrepancy in the title, after which Ames had looked at her differently. Hartwell Crane, Ames said, looking at the filing. Carlisle's man. You know him, Nathan said. I know what he does, Ames said. He files on acceleration clauses. That's his specialty. He finds loan documents with these clauses, and he engineers the triggering conditions. He looked at Elizabeth. You said the title notation was documented as fraudulent. By Abe Whitmore, certified and filed with the District Land Office, she said. 4 days before this. Ames looked at the dates. Carlisle filed the day after Whitmore's certification. Yes, she said. Which I think means they knew the certification was coming and rushed the filing. Ames looked at her with the particular attention of a lawyer who has found someone useful. What they'll argue, he said, is that the triggering condition, the cloud on the title, existed at the point the notation was present regardless of subsequent certification. They'll say the clock started when the cloud appeared, not when it was removed. And what do we argue? Nathan said. We argue that a fraudulent act cannot create a valid legal condition, Elizabeth said. A cloud on a title is only legally meaningful if it represents a real claim. A fabricated notation representing no actual claim at all isn't a cloud, it's a forgery. And the acceleration clause can only be triggered by a real condition, not a manufactured one. Ames looked at her. You've done legal work before, he said. Accounting, she said. But the logic is the same. A number that was entered fraudulently doesn't count. You correct it back to 0. Ames was quiet for a moment. The argument is sound, he said. Whether a Denver judge will agree with it in 26 days is a different question. What do we need? Nathan said. Documentation of the fraud, Ames said. Whitmore's certification helps, but we need more. We need to show that the notation was added deliberately, ideally by someone connected to Carlisle. If we can trace the man who added it back to Carlisle's organization, the fraud becomes his fraud, and that changes everything. He paused. "The man who stayed at your ranch last spring. Do you have any description of him?" Nathan described him. Height, build, coloring, the horse he'd been riding, the brand on the horse. Nathan had noticed the brand which Elizabeth had not known, but was not surprised by, because Nathan noticed the things that mattered in his world, the same way she noticed the things that mattered in hers. Ames wrote it down. "I'll start there," he said. "I have contacts who can run down a horse brand." He looked at Nathan. "Stay in Denver for now. I may need you quickly." "We'll stay," Nathan said. He had said we without pausing, without looking at her for confirmation. "Just we easy as breathing." She noted it and said nothing. They found a boarding house 2 streets from Ames's office, respectable, reasonable. The landlady, a woman named Mrs. Garfield, who took in travelers and asked no questions beyond payment in advance. Nathan took 2 rooms without discussion and paid for both again, and this time Elizabeth said, "I'll pay you back." And he said, "No, you won't." And she said, "Nathan." And he said, "Elizabeth, let me do something useful," with a quiet firmness that made her stop arguing, not because she agreed, but because she could hear underneath the words something that needed to be allowed, the way grief sometimes just needs to be allowed. She let him. She unpacked her bag, 12 minutes worth of packing, 12 minutes worth of unpacking, and sat on the edge of the bed and went over the Carlisle filing one more time in her head. The date, the timing, the specific clause, the law firm, the name Crane. She had been in this situation before, not legally, not with land, but the structure of it was familiar. Someone with power using procedural complexity to make a legitimate thing look illegitimate. Changing the numbers so the total came out wrong, banking on the person being attacked, not knowing enough to find the error. She had been finding errors her whole life. She picked up the copy of the filing and went and knocked on Nathan's door. He opened it immediately, which meant he hadn't been sleeping either. "Crane filed this from a Denver office," she said, holding up the paper. "But he does this work for Carlisle, which means there are other filings, other properties, other people this has been done to." She met Nathan's eyes. If Ames can find other cases where this same pattern was used, same clause, same kind of manufactured title cloud, then it's not just fraud against you. It's a pattern of fraud. That's a different level of case entirely. Nathan stood in the doorway and looked at her. "How long were you thinking about that?" he said. "Since Ames mentioned it was Crane's specialty," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Come in," he said. "We should write it down." They sat at the small table in his room, and she talked through the logic, and he asked the questions that tightened it, the ones about the ranching side, what the land was actually worth, what a genuine sale of the east boundary section would have generated, how much Carlisle stood to gain from the McCready probate land if he controlled the adjacent boundary. Nathan knew the land values the way she knew the numbers, and together the picture that assembled itself was larger than either of them had seen separately. Carlisle wasn't just after Nathan's east boundary. He was assembling a continuous stretch of mountain land running from the Denver foothills to the territorial border, buying it up, parcel by parcel, some through legitimate purchase, some through exactly this method. Nathan's land was a gap in the middle of what Carlisle needed. It had been a target for at least 2 years. The man who had come looking for ranch work last spring had been sent specifically to find the weakness in the title documentation. "How many other ranchers in that valley have loans with Carlisle's lending office?" Elizabeth said. Nathan went very still. "2 that I know of," he said slowly. "Tom Briggs. Different Briggs, not the storekeeper, runs the spread south of mine, and old Walt Harker east of the McCready property." "Have either of them had title questions recently?" Nathan was already standing up. "I need to send a wire," he said. The telegraph office was open until 8, and they made it by 7:40, and Nathan sent 2 wires, one to Sheriff Bridle in Harlan Ridge, asking him to check on Tom Briggs and Walt Harker, and one to Abe Whitmore, asking if he'd seen similar title notations on other properties in the district. They walked back to the boarding house in the early Denver evening, and it was the first time Elizabeth had walked a city street next to Nathan Cole, and the experience was different from walking any street she could remember, not because of the street, but because of the way he moved through it. He didn't take up too much space, and he didn't take up too little. He matched her pace without appearing to think about it. He moved around the obstacles, a cart, a cluster of men outside a saloon, in a way that kept her on the inside without making a performance of it. She noticed all of this with the careful attention she gave to everything, and she stored it in the same place she stored his. You heard after the grain sack, and his you don't have to do it alone anymore at the kitchen table. You're quiet, he said. I'm thinking, she said. Good thoughts or working thoughts? She glanced at him. Is there a difference? Sometimes, he said. She considered. Working thoughts, she said. Mostly. He nodded. Get some rest when you can, he said. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. She almost said, I'm fine, and caught herself. All right, she said instead. He looked at her sideways just briefly, and she thought she saw the almost smile, but the street was dark enough that she couldn't be sure. Ames's wire came the next morning before they'd finished breakfast. Horse brand traced. Rocking C. Carlisle Ranch property. Worker named Dunmore, seasonal hire, spring '84. Currently located South Denver boarding house. Will you come at 9? They were at Ames's office at 8:45. The man named Dunmore turned out to be easier to find than to talk to at first. He was a young man, younger than Elizabeth had expected, maybe 22, with the look of someone who had done something he'd been regretting and hadn't figured out yet whether to say so. Ames had brought him in with the careful phrasing of a lawyer who knows the difference between a witness and a defendant and has chosen deliberately to treat this one as the former. Dunmore looked at Nathan and then looked away. You were at my ranch, Nathan said. It was not a question. I needed work, Dunmore said. And then, Nathan said. A silence. And then Mr. Crane told me I'd get paid to look around, Dunmore said. Said it was just survey work. Said the man who owned the property had questions about the boundaries and wanted an independent. What did you do to the papers? Elizabeth said. Dunmore looked at her. What papers? He said. The title folder, she said. In the chest in the main room. What did you add to it? His jaw worked. He looked at the floor, at Nathan, at the floor again. I copied what Crane wrote out for me, he said. A few words. Said it was just adding a note that should have been there from the start. Said it was legal. He stopped. It wasn't, was it? No, Nathan said. It wasn't. Dunmore looked like a man who was simultaneously relieved to be saying a thing out loud and terrified of what saying it out loud would cost him. I didn't know what it was for, he said. Not exactly. I knew it wasn't right. But Crane paid me $40 and I... He stopped. $40, Nathan said. Yes, sir. Nathan was quiet. Not with anger, or not only with anger. With something more complicated, the look of a man absorbing the specific price someone put on his life's work. Will you say that to a judge? Elizabeth said to Dunmore. Quietly, without pressure. Dunmore looked at her for a long moment. Will it help? He said. Considerably, she said. He looked at Nathan. I'm sorry, he said. About the papers. I'm sorry. Nathan looked at him for a moment, steady and direct. I believe you, he said. And yes, tell the judge. Ames filed the response to Carlisle's acceleration demand that afternoon, with Dunmore's signed statement attached along with Abe Whitmore's certification and Elizabeth's own 3-page accounting of the discrepancy she'd found written out in the clean, precise language she used for accounts, laying out the fraudulent notation, the timing, and the connection to Carlisle's broader land acquisition pattern. Ames read her 3 pages twice. This is very good, he said. I do accounts, she said. You do considerably more than accounts, he said. He set the pages down. I've found 2 other ranchers who've had the same clause invoked in the past 18 months, both in Carlisle's lending portfolio, both with boundary notations that appeared after the loan was made. He looked at Nathan. Your case isn't isolated. If we can get the others on record, this becomes a pattern of fraud, and we take it to the federal level. Tom Briggs and Walt Harker, Nathan said. Among others, Ames said. I have names. They won't come to Denver easily, Nathan said. Some of these men they don't have. Then we go to them, Elizabeth said. Both men looked at her. We have time, she said. We have 24 days before the 30-day window closes. Denver to Harlan Ridge is 3 days. Harlan Ridge to the other properties is a day each. If we move efficiently, we can get statements from at least 4 ranchers and be back here with time to file. Ames looked at Nathan. Nathan looked at Elizabeth. You're proposing we ride the whole valley, he said. I'm proposing we get the evidence that ends this properly, she said. Not just for you, for all of them. He held her gaze. She could see him doing the calculation, the days, the miles, the energy, the risk. And she could see the moment when the calculation finished and he made the decision. When do we leave? He said. Tomorrow morning, she said. Ames was looking between them with an expression that Elizabeth was too busy to analyze. I'll prepare the documentation templates, he said. You just need the signatures. They were 5 days back on the road, and they were the hardest 5 days Elizabeth had spent since leaving Willow Creek, not because of the riding, which she was by now considerably better at than she'd been in July, but because of the conversations. Talking to Tom Briggs, who was 53 and had built his ranch from nothing, and went very quiet when he understood what had been done to him. Talking to Walt Harker, who was angrier than quiet, and whose hands shook when he signed his name to the statement, and who looked at Elizabeth after and said, A woman figured this out. And Nathan said quietly, yes. And Harker said, good, good, and shook her hand with both of his. There were 2 more ranchers beyond those 2 found through Ames's research and Sheriff Bridle's quiet legwork in Harlan Ridge. By the time Elizabeth and Nathan were riding back toward Denver with 4 signed statements and a 5th that had been wired directly to Ames's office, Elizabeth had a number in her head that she kept returning to. Not the loan amount, not the acceleration clause balance, the total amount of land Carlyle had been attempting to control through this method. Laid out across the valley parcel by parcel, the full scheme was visible in a way it wasn't when you looked at any single piece of it. She told Nathan on the 3rd riding day, laid it out the way she'd laid out his loan situation. Here is what we have, here is what we owe, here is where it doesn't reconcile. Nathan listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, He's been planning this for years. At least 4, she said. Possibly longer. He acquired Carlyle's lending office specifically for this. The loans were the mechanism. And we all took them, Nathan said. Most people needed money at some point, she said. That's how it works. You find the need and you offer to meet it, and the terms look manageable, and you bury the dangerous clause deep enough that a man reading his own loan document doesn't find it. She paused. He counted on people not having someone who would look closely. Nathan rode in silence for a moment. He didn't count on you, he said. She glanced at him. He didn't know I existed, she said. Still, Nathan said. Something in the word, the weight he put on it, simple and certain, made her look straight ahead at the road, so she didn't have to manage her own expression. They were 1 day out from Denver when the wire caught up with them. It came through Sheriff Bridle, forwarded to the way station where they'd stopped for the night. Ames had known their route and had been watching for the opportunity. The wire was 3 sentences and changed everything. Federal Land Office investigating Carlyle on complaint from multiple parties. Crane arrested this morning. Your case now part of federal filing. Come directly to federal courthouse on arrival. Elizabeth read it standing in the way station, still in her traveling clothes, and read it again. Nathan read it over her shoulder. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Nathan said, Other people reported him. Someone else found the pattern, she said. Or had been looking already. She put the wire down. It doesn't matter who. What matters is the federal case, he said. If the fraud is federal, she said, then the acceleration clause is void. You can't enforce a contract term that was triggered by the contracting party's own fraud. The loan goes back to its original repayment schedule. She looked at him. "You don't lose the land, Nathan." He was very still. She watched his face and saw him absorb it, not with celebration, not with the release she might have expected, with something quieter and deeper. The particular stillness of a man receiving news that a thing he had been braced to lose is still there. "The others too," he said. "The others too," she said. He nodded slowly. Then he sat down on the bench outside the way station and looked at his hands for a moment and said nothing. She sat down beside him. Not close. Just beside him. The night was coming in from the west. The mountain silhouette she had learned to read in the past 2 months, going dark against a sky that was still pale at the horizon, and it was quiet enough out here that she could hear both their breathing. 13 years, he said. "I know," she said. "I thought—" He stopped. His jaw worked for a moment. "For a while back there, I thought I might lose it." "I know," she said. He looked at his hands. "Margaret and I built the first fence together," he said. "The south pasture fence. She was better at it than me. She had a better eye for the level." He paused. "I've been redoing that fence every few years because she taught me how." Elizabeth held very still. She understood with the precision she brought to everything what he was telling her. Not just about the fence. About what the land meant, what it held, what losing it would have cost him in ways that had nothing to do with money. "It's still yours," she said. He looked at her. In the last light, his face was open in a way she had not seen it before. Not just the fraction of an inch softening she had learned to read, but something more, something that had been held carefully closed for a long time and had just quietly come open. "Thank you," he said. "You'd have found it," she said. "Not in time," he said. For the second time. Not in time. The words he kept coming back to, the ones that meant something specific. She looked at him directly. "Nathan," she said, "I need to say something." He waited. "I came here because I needed a place," she said. That was the truth. "I answered your advertisement because I needed somewhere to be that wasn't my brother's house, and I didn't come here with any expectation of anything more than that." She paused. Let herself be accurate. But somewhere in the past 2 months, between the grain sack and the ledger and the fence posts, and Denver somewhere in all of that, this stopped being just a place I needed and started being something else. He was very still. "Something else," he said. "A life," she said. "A real one. With work that matters and people who see me and—" She stopped, made herself say the harder part. "And you." The words sat between them in the mountain evening air. Nathan looked at her for a long moment with those dark, steady eyes, and in them, she could see the calculation running, the same one she'd seen on his face in the Denver boarding house in Ames's office at the fence line when he'd told her about Margaret. The careful, deliberate assessment of weight-bearing capacity, whether a thing would hold. "I've been thinking about that fence in the south pasture," he said. She waited. "Margaret and I built it," he said. "And I've been redoing it because she taught me how. But I've been redoing it alone." He paused. "I'd like to have someone beside me again. When I redo it." It was not a declaration. It was not poetic. It was Nathan Cole saying the true thing, simply because he didn't know how to say things any other way. She looked at him for a moment. "I'll need you to show me how," she said. "The level thing." "You'll pick it up fast," he said. "You always do." She laughed, a real one, quick and surprised, and his mouth did the thing that had become fully a smile, now real and brief and startling, the way it had been the first time she'd seen it. They sat in the mountain evening side by side on the bench outside the way station, and the stars were coming out one by one, the way they did out here, generously, like they had nowhere else to be. Tomorrow was Denver, and the federal courthouse, and the end of Daniel Carlisle's careful, patient land scheme. But tonight was the bench and the stars, and a man who built fences to remember the people he loved, and a woman who had burned her brother's letter and ridden towards something real. Tomorrow could wait another hour. They rode into Denver the next morning with the signed statements, the wire from Ames, and the particular quiet of 2 people who had said something important the night before and were still living inside it. Elizabeth had slept better than she had any right to given everything. She woke up with the numbers still in her head. They were always there, orderly and waiting. But underneath the numbers was something warmer. Something that hadn't been there 2 months ago when she'd stood on a train platform in Harlan Ridge with $3.40 and a one-word letter that said, "Come." She was thinking about fence posts. Nathan saddled the horses without being asked and handed her the canteen, the way he always did. And they didn't talk much on the last stretch of road. But the silence had changed quality. Again, had deepened into something that wasn't absence, but presence. The way a good room feels full, even when no one is speaking. Ames met them outside the courthouse. He was moving fast, which was new. Ames was a man who moved at the speed of careful, and seeing him cross the street toward them at something close to urgency told Elizabeth the situation had shifted since his wire. "Carlyle is here," Ames said. Nathan went still on his horse. "In Denver," he said. "In the building," Ames said. "He came in this morning with 4 lawyers. He's trying to negotiate before the federal filing becomes official." He looked at both of them. "The federal investigator man named Aldrich out of the land office wants to talk to you both before he meets with Carlyle's people. He's been waiting since 8. Elizabeth was already dismounting. "Let's go," she said. Aldrich was a lean, precise man in his 40s, with the particular quality of someone who had spent a career separating what people said from what was actually true. He shook Nathan's hand, and then Elizabeth's with equal weight, which she noticed and appreciated, and he sat them down in a small office on the 2nd floor and put a file on the table that was considerably thicker than Elizabeth had expected. "How long have you been investigating Carlyle?" she said. 14 months, Aldrich said. "We had suspicions and no proof until recently. The pattern was there, but pattern isn't evidence." He looked at the file. "Your case broke it open. The combination of Whitmore's certification, Dunmore's statement, and your accounting of the discrepancy that gave us what we needed to get a federal warrant." He paused. "And then your rancher statements from the valley confirmed the scale." "How many properties?" Nathan said. 11 confirmed, Aldrich said. "Possibly 14. He's been doing this across 3 territories." 11. Elizabeth had estimated 8, and had thought that was a conservative number. "What happens now?" Nathan said. "Carlyle is attempting to settle," Aldrich said. "His lawyers have a number they're prepared to offer. Restitution to the affected ranchers in exchange for federal charges being reduced to civil fraud." He looked at Nathan steadily. "I want to be transparent with you that option exists. It would be faster. You'd have your loan voided today and potentially some restitution money." "And Carlyle," Elizabeth said. "Civil penalties, no criminal conviction." Aldrich's voice was neutral. He was giving information, not a recommendation. Nathan looked at Elizabeth. She looked back at him. "How many of those 11 ranchers lost land they couldn't get back?" she said to Aldrich. 3, Aldrich said. "They settled with Carlyle under pressure before the fraud was identified. They accepted what they thought was fair market value. It wasn't." "And a civil settlement helps them how?" she said. "It doesn't," Aldrich said. "Not significantly." Elizabeth looked at Nathan. "Then no settlement," she said. Nathan held her gaze for a moment. "No settlement," he said. Aldrich nodded once, like he'd been hoping for this answer, but had needed them to arrive at it themselves. "I'll need your statements formally entered," he said. "And your availability over the next week. There will be a federal hearing. Carlyle's lawyers will try to complicate the timeline." "We're not going anywhere," Elizabeth said. Carlyle's lawyers did try to complicate the timeline. They were very good at it, filing motions requesting continuances, challenging the admissibility of Dunmore's statement on the grounds that it had been obtained without proper legal counsel present. Ames countered each move with the careful precision of a man who had been waiting 14 months for a real case and was not going to let procedural theater win it. Elizabeth sat in on every hearing she was permitted to attend, which was not all of them, but enough. She saw Daniel Carlyle for the first time on the third day of proceedings, a well-dressed man in his 50s, silver-haired, with the particular smoothness of someone who had spent a career making theft look like business. He sat at his lawyer's table with the composure of a man who had been in difficult rooms before and expected to walk out of them, and he looked at the ranchers and their representatives with the careful non-expression of someone who had long since stopped thinking of other people as people. He looked at Elizabeth just once briefly, the way you'd glance at a minor obstacle, and then he looked away. She thought about Tom Briggs going quiet when he understood what had been done to him, about Walt Harker's shaking hands on the pen, about 3 ranchers who had lost land they would never get back because one man in a Denver office had decided their lives were a mechanism for his enrichment. She looked at the papers in her lap, at the numbers she had organized into the clearest possible account of what had been done, and she felt something steady and cold and completely certain settle in her chest. She had been told her whole life that her skill with numbers was showing off, that it made people uncomfortable, that it wasn't appropriate. She put her papers on the table in front of Ames. "This is everything," she said. "Every property, every loan date, every clause invocation, every fraudulent notation cross-referenced against Dunmore's statement and the survey records. 11 properties with full documentation, 3 with partial." Ames looked at the stack. "You did this last night?" he said. "And this morning," she said. "I started at 4. He looked at her. "Miss Carter," he said, "you are the most useful person I have encountered in 20 years of land law." She picked up her coffee. "I do accounts," she said. The twist came on the 4th day, and it came from a direction Elizabeth had not anticipated, which was the only direction that truly qualified as a surprise. Pete Greer walked into the federal hearing room, not as a witness for Carlyle, as a witness for Aldrich. Elizabeth saw him come through the door and felt Nathan go rigid beside her, and she put her hand on the table between them, not touching him, just close a quiet signal, and he steadied. Pete Greer was 25 years old and had clearly spent the past week making a decision he wasn't entirely comfortable with. He sat in the witness position with the posture of someone bracing for impact, and told the room clearly, specifically, and with the particular credibility of someone who has nothing left to lose by telling the truth, that J. Hartwell Crane had hired him to investigate Nathan Cole's property and to identify any documentation vulnerabilities that could be exploited for a title challenge. That he had reported what he found directly to Crane. That Crane had then sent Dunmore to add the fraudulent notation. He had not added the notation himself, but he had found the vulnerability. "Why are you testifying?" Carlyle's lead lawyer said during his examination. The question had an edge to it, the suggestion that Greer was motivated by something other than honesty. "Because I went to Harlan Ridge to ask questions about a man's land," Greer said. "And while I was there, I saw what that man had built, and I saw the woman who'd come to help him keep it, and I—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "I knew what Crane was going to do with what I found. And I told myself I didn't know because the money was good, but I knew." He looked at Nathan directly. "Your east fence line is the best maintained boundary in that valley," he said. "Anyone who walked it would know that land is cared for." Nathan said nothing, but something in his face just slightly changed. "That's all," Greer said. After the hearing in the corridor outside, Elizabeth found Pete Greer sitting on a bench looking like a man who had just put down something heavy and wasn't sure yet what to do with his hands. She stopped in front of him. He looked up. "Miss Carter," he said. "You tipped your hat to me," she said, "when you left Harlan Ridge, after Samuel." He nodded. "I knew by then that what was happening wasn't right. It was the only thing I could do that didn't cost me anything yet." He paused. "Not very brave." "No," she said. "But you came here." He looked at his hands. "Your brother," he said. "Samuel. He didn't know about the land scheme. He doesn't know Carlyle. He was just, Crane heard about your situation and saw an opportunity to use Samuel's arrival as a distraction. Finch, either." Elizabeth was quiet for a moment. She had suspected as much. Samuel had been a convenient tool, not a co-conspirator. It changed what he was, reduced him from deliberate villain to something more complicated and in some ways harder to categorize. A man who had been cruel and controlling and had tried to sell his sister's future to pay his debts, and who had also been used without his knowledge by a larger, colder scheme. "I know," she said. Greer looked up at her. "You're not angry at him." "I'm angry at him for different reasons," she said. "Not for that." She left him on the bench and went back to find Nathan. The federal ruling came 6 days later. Carlisle was convicted on 7 counts of fraud with additional charges pending on the 3 properties where land had been improperly transferred. Crane received a separate conviction. The Carlisle lending office was placed under federal receivership, and all loan documents with the fraudulent acceleration clause were voided. Nathan's loan went back to its original repayment schedule. The 3 ranchers who had lost land received federal restitution orders, not enough to fully repair what had been taken, but enough to start again. Ames shook Nathan's hand for a long time when it was over. Then he shook Elizabeth's hand and said, "If you ever want to do this professionally, the accounting, the document analysis, I know 3 federal offices that would pay you considerably more than Douglas Hale." She smiled. "I'll keep it in mind," she said. Ames looked between them. "You're going back to the mountain," he said. "Yes," Nathan said. Ames nodded like that was the right answer, like he'd known it would be. They left Denver on a Thursday morning, and the ride back felt different from every other ride they'd made, different from the urgent ride down, different from the Long Valley circuit to collect statements, different from the very first ride up the mountain when she hadn't known what she was riding toward. She knew now. Somewhere in the second day of riding, Nathan said Ames wasn't wrong. She looked at him. "About what?" "The federal offices," he said. "You could do that work." "I could," she said. "I don't want to." He was quiet for a moment. "Why not?" he said. Not challenging, genuinely asking. She thought about how to say the true thing accurately. "Because Douglas Hale's accounts matter to Douglas Hale," she said. "Because the Valley Ranchers' loans mattered to the Valley Ranchers. Because your ledger—" She paused. "The work means more when it's for people you know. When the numbers represent actual lives you can see." She looked at him. "I don't want to do it from a federal office in Denver. I want to do it from somewhere real." He looked at her for a moment. "Harlan Ridge has a need for an actual bookkeeper," he said. "Someone who works across multiple businesses. Clara's been handling her own accounts wrong for 8 years, and she knows it." "I know," Elizabeth said. "She told me." "You could build that," he said. "Your own practice, your own clients, your own—" "Nathan," she said. He stopped. "Are you trying to talk me into staying?" she said. He held her gaze. "Yes," he said. She looked at him. "You don't need to," she said. "I'm already staying." Something moved through his face, the complicated, unguarded thing she'd seen on the way station bench, and then he nodded once and looked back at the road ahead, but the set of his shoulders was different. Lighter. Like a man who had been carrying something he'd finally been allowed to put down. They came up the mountain trail in the late afternoon of the 3rd day, and the ranch came around the bend the same way it had the very first time, the cabin, the barn, the fence, the pasture. But it looked different now. Not because it had changed, because she had. She had arrived here in July with a leather bag and a tin box and the last of her courage. She was arriving again in September with considerably more, not in her bag, but in her. Nathan reined in at the gate the way he always did, checking the fence line by habit, and she reined in beside him and looked at the property and thought about 11 ranchers and fraudulent notations and a man with silver hair who had looked at her once and looked away, and she thought about Dunmore and his $40 and his regret, and she thought about Pete Greer tipping his hat outside the sheriff's office in Harlan Ridge. She thought about Samuel saying, "I know." "There's a letter waiting," Nathan said. She turned. He was holding a folded paper he'd taken from the gatepost where the Harlan Ridge delivery boy left things when the ranch was empty. He held it out. She looked at the handwriting. Samuel. She took it. Held it for a moment without opening it the way she'd held his last letter, but the feeling was different now. No contraction in her chest. No old mechanism firing. Just paper. She opened it. Elizabeth, it said. And then below that, a single paragraph in her brother's angular handwriting pressed hard into the paper, the way he pressed everything. I have been thinking about what you said in Harlan Ridge, about the farm, and about Mother. I don't expect you to forgive me for what I tried to do, but I want you to know that I understand now that it was wrong. Not just because it didn't work, because it was wrong from the beginning. I don't know how to be different than I am, but I am trying to figure it out. If you are willing to help with the farm accounts by letter, I would be grateful. If you are not, I understand that too. Samuel. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her pocket. Nathan was watching her without pressing. He's trying, she said. I don't know if it'll last, but he's trying. What do you want to do? Nathan said. She thought about it honestly. I'll write back, she said. I'll help with the accounts. From a distance. She paused. He's still my brother. Yeah, Nathan said. That doesn't mean what he did was all right. No, Nathan said. It doesn't. It just means... She stopped, found the right words. It means I'm not going to spend the rest of my life carrying something that belongs to him. Nathan looked at her with those dark, steady eyes. Good, he said. The same way he'd said it before. Not good that's settled, but good, I'm glad you have that. Good that's yours. She swung down from her horse and opened the gate. The south pasture fence needed work. It had needed work since before she arrived, and the Denver trip had pushed it further down the list, and now in the September light, she could see 3 posts that were leaning, and a section of wire that had worked loose near the corner. Nathan saw it at the same time she did. Tomorrow, he said. Today, she said. He looked at her. We just rode 3 days, he said. I know, she said. But you said you wanted someone beside you when you redid it. He was quiet for a moment. I did say that, he said. Then let's do it today, she said. While we still have light. He looked at her the way he'd been looking at her more often lately, with something open and undefended and real. And then he went to the barn and came back with the post hole digger and the wire stretcher and the level, and he handed her the level. You watch the bubble, he said. I'll set the post. Show me how, she said. Hold it flat against the post, he said. When the bubble's centered, the post is plumb. She held the level the way he showed her. He drove the post. Well, he said. She looked at the bubble. Half a hair right, she said. He adjusted. She looked again. There, she said. They worked the fence line for 2 hours in the September afternoon, and she learned the level, and he learned that she learned things faster than he expected, which he already knew, but which kept surprising him, and by the time the light was going, they had reset 4 posts and restretched 2 sections of wire, and the south pasture fence was solid. Nathan put his hand on the last post and tested it, pressed it with his full weight the way he tested all of them. It held. He looked at her. Good post, he said. Good teacher, she said. He shook his head slightly, the almost smile losing the battle the way it always did now. She looked at the fence line straight and solid in the fading light, the wire running clean between posts that would last another decade. Nathan, she said. Yeah, he said. She turned to face him directly in the full September light with the mountain ranch behind her, and the valley below, and the fence they'd just fixed between them, and the whole of what they'd built, the accounts and the statements, and the Denver courthouse, and the grain sack, and the ledger, and the bench by the way station, all of it present in the air around them. Ask me, she said. He looked at her. He understood what she meant. She could see it, the recognition, the steadiness, the weight-bearing calculation completing itself one final time. "Elizabeth Carter," he said, "will you stay on this mountain with me? Not as a hired hand, and not as a temporary arrangement. As my wife." He said it the way he said everything, quietly, directly, without decoration. Like a fence post set in good deep ground. Like a thing that was already true and simply needed saying. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the match she'd struck in Willow Creek, the paper curling to ash, the $3.40 in her tin box. She thought about the one-word letter. She thought about "you hurt, and not in time, and I'll be here," and the south pasture fence, and a photograph of a dark-haired woman who had taught this man that love was worth building, even knowing it could be lost. She thought about what she had come here to find, a place where she was treated like a person. She had found considerably more than that. "Yes," she said. Nathan Cole nodded once, slowly, completely, and the corner of his mouth did the thing that had become a real smile, and he stepped forward and took her hand in both of his, with the careful, deliberate gentleness of a man who understood that some things deserved to be held exactly right. She looked down at her hand in his, her capable, ink-stained, ledger-worn, post-hole-digging hand, and she thought that she had never felt more like herself than she did right now. "Drunk!" Clara cried at the wedding, which she flatly denied afterward, and Douglas Hale gave a toast that was gruff and approximately 40 seconds long, and somehow said everything. Harriet Oakes made the dress, which was not white, because Elizabeth chose blue, the particular blue of the mountain sky in early October, which was a color she had decided was hers. Abe Whitmore rode up from Denver, which no one had asked him to do, but everyone was glad of. Walt Harker and Tom Briggs came down from the valley and shook Nathan's hand for a long time, the way men shake hands when the words aren't sufficient. Pete Greer sent a letter. He was in Wyoming working an honest job. He wished them well. He said he was glad the fence held. Samuel did not come, which was the right choice for everyone, and he sent a letter instead with a careful, correct accounting of the Willow Creek Farm's current state. The numbers organized more neatly than Elizabeth had ever seen Samuel organize anything, which told her that somewhere in Willow Creek, something was shifting slowly, in whatever direction Samuel Carter was capable of shifting. She wrote back with suggestions. She would keep writing back. Not because everything was forgiven, some of it wasn't and might never be, but because she had decided not to carry what belonged to him, and that decision required tending. The first winter on the mountain was hard, in the way mountain winters are always hard, relentless and cold and demanding, in ways that required everything you had. Elizabeth spent it, keeping accounts for 6 businesses in Harlan Ridge, riding down twice a week, regardless of weather, which Nathan worried about quietly, and she managed competently, and they argued about once with complete love and no resolution. She also spent it learning the ranch in winter, which was different from the ranch in summer. The specific weight of the cold, the way the horses needed more watching the rhythm of firewood and stores, and the particular satisfaction of a pantry that had been properly stocked because she had been the one to stock it. She spent it learning Nathan in winter too, which was its own education. He was quieter in the cold, more interior, the way some people go when the season pulls inward. He was more likely to sit by the fire in the evenings, less likely to talk. She learned not to push into the silence, but to sit inside it with him. And she learned that this was something he needed, the way she needed the accounts, a way of processing the world that worked for him, specifically not a sign of distance. She told him this one evening, just that she understood, and he looked at her with an expression she had never quite seen on his face before, surprised and grateful and briefly undone, and he said, "Margaret used to think I was angry when I got quiet." And she said, "Were you?" And he said, "Sometimes, not always." And she said, "I'll learn to tell the difference." And he said, "You probably already have," which was the kind of thing Nathan Cole said that landed without warning and stayed for days. She thought about Margaret less with envy than with something closer to gratitude as winter went on. The woman in the photograph had loved this man well enough that his love for her had made him into someone worth loving again. That was not a competition. That was a gift. She put fresh flowers in the small vase she'd started keeping near the photograph when flowers were available. And in winter, she put a sprig of pine instead. And Nathan never said anything about it. But one morning, she came out of the bedroom to find he had moved the photograph to the windowsill, where the morning light hit it better, and that said everything it needed to. In the spring, a letter arrived from Robert Ames in Denver. The federal investigation had concluded. Carlisle had been sentenced. The 3 ranchers who had lost land had received their restitution, and one of them, old Walt Harker, had used his share to buy back a portion of what he'd lost, and had written Elizabeth a letter that made her have to step outside for a few minutes. Ames's letter also contained a formal offer. Would Elizabeth Carter Cole? Now she had been signing her name that way for months, and it still felt new and exact, like a number that finally balanced. Would Elizabeth Carter Cole be willing to consult on an ongoing basis for the Federal Land Office regarding document fraud identification? The work could be done primarily by correspondence. The pay was more than she made from all 6 Harlan Ridge businesses combined. She brought the letter to Nathan at the fence line, the east fence this time, which they had both walked several times since returning from Denver, the way you revisit a thing that almost wasn't there. He read it, handed it back. "What do you want to do?" he said. Same question he always asked. What do you want? Not what should you do. Not what makes sense. Not what would I prefer. What do you want? She looked at the letter in her hand. She thought about Aldrich's careful precision and Crane in the courtroom, and the stack of 11 property files she had organized at 4 in the morning, and the particular feeling of finding an error that had been hidden, the click of it, the correction, the number going back to what it should always have been. "I want to do it," she said. "Then do it," he said. "It'll take time away from the ranch accounts," she said. "I can handle my own accounts," he said. "Nathan," she said, "your accounts are a disaster." "They've always been a disaster," he said. "I've survived." "You had a $14 discrepancy that threw off your supply calculations for an entire winter," she said. "And you fixed it," he said. "So teach me what you fixed, and I'll maintain it, and you can do the federal work." She looked at him. "You want me to teach you accounting," she said. "I want to be useful to you," he said. "Same as you've been useful to me." He looked at her steadily. "That's how it works, Elizabeth. Both directions." She looked at this man, this patient, quiet, fence-post-setting coffee-making you hurt. Asking man who had written, "Come in a letter," because he recognized someone asking for the right thing, and she thought that of all the numbers she had ever worked with, he was the one she was most grateful to have found the value of. "All right," she said. "Both directions." She wrote to Ames that evening and accepted the offer. She wrote to Samuel that same evening with the corrected figures for the Willow Creek Farm spring planting budget. And then, she sat at the kitchen table in the mountain cabin in the early Colorado spring with the accounts spread around her and the window open to the sound of Nathan checking the fence line in the last light, and she thought about a woman who had burned a letter in the dirt and counted $3.40 and decided that running towards something was better than running away. She had been right. This was the life she had chosen. The accounts and the fence posts and the difficult winters, and the man who said true things simply, and the mountain that asked everything of you and gave everything back. This was real, all of it. And real, she had learned, was the only thing worth building toward. Elizabeth Carter. Cole closed her ledger, put the pen down, and stepped outside into the spring evening where Nathan was waiting. Not waiting for her exactly, just there. The way he was always just there, solid and steady in the mountain air. She walked out to meet him. And the life they had built with their own hands, and their own stubborn refusal to let it be taken from them, stretched out before them on the mountain, like good land earned, tended, and absolutely permanently theirs.